Good evening and welcome back. Tonight we're drifting through the extraordinary life of Queen Victoria and the empire that grew beneath her steady hand, an empire so vast that darkness never fell upon all its territories at once. Whether you're settling into sleep or simply seeking a moment of calm reflection, I'm grateful you're here with me on this gentle journey through Victorian England and the reaching tendrils of British influence that would touch every inhabited continent. What was this empire that Victoria inherited as a young woman barely out of childhood? How did scattered colonial outposts transform into the most powerful dominion the world had ever witnessed? Why does her reign still capture our imagination nearly 2 centuries after she first placed the crown upon her dark hair? We'll explore where Victoria's story began in the quiet nurseries of Kensington Palace, what shaped her understanding of power and responsibility, and how the British Empire expanded from trading posts and naval stations into territories governing a quarter of the world's population. As always, I'd love to know where in the world you're listening from and what time is it for you. Whether you're here to drift into sleep or to follow the gentle currents of history, I'm glad you're with me. Now let's begin. The year was 1819, and in the grand halls of Kensington Palace, a future empress was taking her first breath. The morning arrived quietly, as spring mornings do in London, with pale light filtering through tall windows and the distant sounds of the city awakening beyond the palace walls. Victoria Alexandrina entered a world where her destiny seemed anything but certain, where the line of succession wound through uncles and cousins in ways that made her eventual reign appear a distant possibility at best. The infant princess had no way of knowing that she would one day rule over territories so vast that the sun would never set upon them. Her small hands reached for nothing more than her mother's warmth, unaware that those same hands would one day sign documents that would reshape the map of the world itself. The nursery where she spent her earliest days smelled of beeswax candles and the faint lavender water her nurses used to freshen the linens. Outside her windows, London carried on its business, the clatter of carriage wheels on cobblestones mixing with the calls of street vendors and the distant chime of church bells marking the hours. Picture young Victoria awakening each morning in her simply furnished bedroom, the pale London light filtering through tall windows as her German governess, Baroness Letzen, gently roused her for another day of careful education. The princess would rise at 7 o'clock sharp, her small hands reaching for the simple white dress laid out for her. There were no royal luxuries for this future queen. Her mother, the Duchess of Kent, insisted on a Spartan upbringing that would build character rather than indulgence, a childhood designed to prepare her for responsibilities no one yet knew she would inherit. Victoria's mornings began with a breakfast of plain bread and milk, eaten in silence while her tutors prepared the day's lessons. The bread was brown and dense, sometimes spread with a thin layer of butter that melted into the warm crust. The milk came fresh from the palace dairy, cool and sweet, carried up the servants' stairs in pewter pitchers that sweated in the morning air. She would sit at her small writing desk, her feet barely touching the floor, practicing her penmanship with careful strokes of the quill. The sound of her pen scratching against parchment mixed with the distant sounds of carriages rolling past the palace gates, carrying the business of a kingdom she did not yet know she would inherit. The ink smelled of oak, galls, and iron, leaving stains on her small fingers that her governess would gently wash away each evening. Each letter had to be formed with precision, each word carefully considered. Victoria learned early that her thoughts mattered, that the words she wrote would carry weight and consequence. Her tutors moved around her with quiet efficiency, their footsteps muffled by thick carpets. Their voices kept low and measured to maintain the atmosphere of focused study. Her education was rigorous and methodical. History lessons transported her to ancient civilizations where she learned of Rome's legions marching across Europe and Egypt's pharaohs building monuments that would outlast empires. Geography opened her mind to distant lands she could barely imagine, her finger tracing coastlines on maps whose edges faded into unknown territories marked only with speculation and sailors' tales. Little did she know that many of these far-off places would one day bow before her crown, that British ships would carry her authority to shores whose very existence was still being discovered by explorers pushing into uncharted waters. The young princess would trace her finger along the coastlines of India and Australia, never dreaming that British governors would one day administer justice in her name across those distant territories. She memorized the names of rivers that wound through continents she had never seen, mountain ranges that divided peoples she would one day govern, and oceans that British vessels would cross carrying both commerce and imperial authority to the furthest reaches of the globe. The afternoon hours found Victoria in the palace gardens, walking with measured steps along carefully manicured paths where roses bloomed in ordered beds, and gravel crunched softly beneath her shoes. The air carried the scent of boxwood hedges and the sweet perfume of climbing jasmine that covered the garden walls. Her mother maintained strict control over every aspect of her life, implementing what would later be known as the Kensington System, a rigid protocol that meant Victoria was never alone, never allowed to walk downstairs without someone holding her hand, and never permitted to meet people without careful supervision. The lonely princess found solace in her dolls, creating elaborate stories and conversations with these silent companions who became her closest friends. She would arrange them in careful rows, assigning each one a personality and a voice, conducting entire courts and conversations in the privacy of her room. These childhood games taught her things no tutor could impart: how to listen to different perspectives, how to negotiate conflicts, and how to maintain authority while showing kindness. The dolls asked nothing of her except her imagination, and in return they provided companionship that the isolated protocols of her upbringing denied her among living children. As evening approached, Victoria would sit in the drawing room while her mother entertained visitors. The soft glow of candlelight danced across the walls as conversations flowed around topics of politics and society. Beeswax candles burned in silver sconces, their warm light catching the gold thread in the upholstery and casting long shadows that swayed when anyone moved. The young princess listened intently, absorbing discussions about the state of the kingdom, the struggles of the working classes, and the growing tensions across Europe. These conversations planted seeds of understanding that would later bloom into the wisdom of an empress. She heard about the mills of Manchester where steam engines had replaced human hands, about the coal mines where children younger than herself labored in darkness, about the ships that sailed to India and China carrying British goods and returning with silks and spices and tea. She learned that power came with responsibility, that wealth carried obligations, and that the throne she might one day inherit demanded more than ceremony and comfort. It required understanding, compassion, and the strength to make decisions that would affect millions of lives she would never personally encounter. During these early years, Victoria had no knowledge of her proximity to the throne. Her uncle, King William IV, ruled without direct heirs, but the line of succession seemed distant and uncertain. The princess went to sleep each night in her narrow bed, her hand held by the attendant who sat beside her until she drifted off, unaware that fate was quietly arranging the pieces that would transform her from a sheltered child into the most powerful monarch on earth. The turning point came on a quiet morning in 1830, when Victoria was just 11 years old. Her governess approached with unusual solemnity, carrying a family tree that would change everything. The parchment rustled as it was spread before her on the polished mahogany table, its branches and lines drawn in careful ink that had faded slightly with age. As the genealogical chart was laid out, Victoria's eyes traced the lines of succession with growing realization. There, just a few steps from the crown, was her own name written in the same formal script as the kings and queens who had ruled for centuries before. The moment of discovery was profound yet quiet. No dramatic music accompanied this revelation, only the gentle tick of the mantel clock and the whispered explanation of her destiny. The clock's mechanism clicked and whirred softly, marking seconds that suddenly felt weighted with meaning. Outside the window, London continued its daily business, unaware that a child within the palace walls had just learned she would likely one day rule over them all. From that day forward, Victoria's education took on new urgency and purpose. Her tutors began preparing her not just as a lady of noble birth but as a future sovereign who would need to understand the complexities of governance. She studied constitutional law and parliamentary procedure, learning about the delicate balance between royal prerogative and democratic representation that defined the British system. The leather-bound volumes her tutors placed before her smelled of old paper and library dust, their pages filled with dense text about rights and responsibilities, precedents and procedures. The princess began each morning with lessons in statecraft, reading dispatches from various corners of the growing empire. Reports arrived from India, where British influence was expanding through the East India Company's commercial and military presence. The papers described territories with names she struggled to pronounce, populations that numbered in the millions, and wealth that flowed through trade in cotton and indigo and opium. Letters from Canada described the challenges of governing diverse populations across vast wilderness territories where French and English settlers maintained their separate traditions while sharing the same harsh winters and promising summers. Documents from Australia detailed the establishment of penal colonies that were slowly transforming into thriving settlements. She read accounts of convicts who had completed their sentences and claimed land of their own, building farms and businesses in a country so far from England that the seasons themselves were reversed, where Christmas came in summer heat and winter brought mild temperatures that would seem like spring to English sensibilities. Victoria's afternoons were devoted to understanding the economic forces that drove British expansion. She learned about the cotton mills of Manchester, where steam-powered machinery was revolutionizing textile production. The princess studied reports from Liverpool's bustling docks, where ships departed daily carrying British manufactured goods to distant markets and returned laden with raw materials from colonial territories. The rhythms of empire were rhythms of exchange, of cotton flowing from India and America to be spun and woven in England, then shipped back as finished cloth to the very places. The concept of free trade fascinated the young princess as she grasped how British naval supremacy protected merchant vessels, carrying goods across the world's oceans. She learned about the great trading houses whose names appeared on warehouse doors from London to Canton, about the insurance companies that spread the risks of long voyages across multiple investors, and about the banks that financed expeditions to territories where fortunes could be made or lost based on the timing of monsoons and the whims of local rulers. Her tutors explained how the Royal Navy's dominance ensured that British commerce could flow freely while competing nations struggled to protect their own trading routes. This maritime advantage was becoming the foundation upon which a global empire would be built. Victoria studied maps that showed British naval stations scattered across the world's oceans like a string of pearls, each one a point where ships could take on fresh water and supplies, repair damage from storms, and receive protection from pirates or hostile vessels. Evening lessons focused on the social challenges facing her future subjects. Victoria read about the growing industrial cities where factory workers labored in difficult conditions for long hours. She studied reports about child labor in coal mines and the emergence of reform movements calling for better working conditions. These early exposures to social issues would later influence her approach to governance and her support for various reform initiatives that would gradually improve the lives of working people throughout her realm. The princess also learned about the complex relationships between different social classes in British society. The aristocracy maintained their traditional privileges, while a growing middle class of merchants and professionals was gaining economic power and political influence. Meanwhile, the working classes were beginning to organize and demand representation in government decisions that affected their daily lives. Victoria understood that the Crown would need to navigate carefully between these competing interests, maintaining stability while allowing necessary reforms to proceed. As Victoria approached her teenage years, her preparation for queenship intensified. She practiced receiving foreign dignitaries, learning the subtle protocols that govern diplomatic interactions. Mock ceremonies taught her the importance of royal symbolism and the careful choreography required for state occasions. Every gesture and expression would carry meaning once she ascended to the throne. She learned to incline her head just so when acknowledging a beau, to extend her hand at precisely the right angle for kissing, and to maintain an expression that conveyed both dignity and approachability. The princess began studying the personalities and politics of European royal families, understanding how marriages and alliances could strengthen or weaken Britain's international position. She learned about the complex web of relationships that connected various monarchies, and how these connections could be leveraged to advance British interests on the continental stage. Her tutors created elaborate family trees showing which princess had married, which prince, which royal house held grudges against another, and which alliances might be cultivated to Britain's advantage. Her education also encompassed the growing influence of public opinion in shaping government policy. The expansion of literacy and the growth of newspapers meant that political decisions were increasingly scrutinized by an informed citizenry. Victoria learned to understand how royal actions could influence public sentiment and how popular support could strengthen or undermine governmental authority. The press could be both ally and adversary, capable of building up a monarch's reputation or tearing it down with equal efficiency. The mechanical innovations transforming British society captured Victoria's imagination as she learned about steam engines. These technologies were not merely curiosities, but tools that would enable more effective administration of a global empire. Messages that once took months to cross oceans could now be transmitted in weeks, while steam-powered ships could carry troops and supplies with unprecedented speed and reliability. By 1837, as Victoria approached her 18th birthday, the aging King William IV's health was clearly declining. The princess had transformed from a sheltered child into a young woman who understood the magnitude of the responsibilities awaiting her. Her daily routine now resembled that of a monarch in training, with formal audiences, policy briefings, and ceremonial duties filling her schedule. She moved through the palace with growing confidence, her childhood isolation giving way to purposeful preparation for the role that awaited her. The final months before her accession were filled with intensive preparation for the transition of power. Victoria studied the precedents and procedures that would govern her coronation, learning about the ancient rituals that would transform her from princess to sovereign. She practiced the oaths she would take, and rehearsed the responses she would give to the various ceremonies that would mark her formal acceptance of royal authority. Each word of the coronation service carried centuries of meaning. Each gesture connected her to the long line of monarchs who had ruled before her. As spring turned to summer in 1837, everyone in the palace could sense that momentous changes were approaching. The young princess who had once played with dolls in the palace nursery was about to inherit an empire whose influence was spreading across continents and oceans. The quiet preparation of her youth was about to give way to the grand responsibilities of ruling the most powerful nation on earth. The morning of June 20, 1837 dawned grey and misty over London. In her chamber at Kensington Palace, 18-year-old Victoria stirred beneath her simple cotton sheets, unaware that this would be her last day as a princess. The soft patter of rain against her windows mixed with the distant sounds of the city awakening. Servants moved quietly through the corridors, their footsteps muffled by thick carpets as they prepared for what they sensed would be a day unlike any other. The Archbishop of Canterbury and the Lord Chamberlain arrived at the palace before dawn, their carriages clattering through the gates while most of London still slept. They waited in the formal receiving room, their solemn faces reflecting the gravity of the news they carried. King William IV had passed away at Windsor Castle during the early hours, and with his death the crown had passed to the young woman who still slumbered peacefully upstairs. When Victoria was finally awakened at 6 o'clock, she descended the grand staircase in her dressing gown and slippers, her dark hair loose around her shoulders. The moment she entered the room and saw the assembled officials, she understood immediately. There was no need for elaborate explanations. The weight of destiny settled upon her small frame as she listened to the formal announcement of her uncle's death and her own accession to the throne. Her first act as queen was to request a moment alone. In the quiet of her private sitting room, Victoria knelt and prayed, asking for guidance in the enormous task that lay before her. The room was still and silent, except for the soft sound of rain continuing against the windows. When she emerged, she was no longer the sheltered princess who had been kept from independent thought and action. She was Queen Victoria, sovereign of the United Kingdom and ruler of territories that stretched from the foggy shores of Britain to the sun-baked plains of India. The transformation was immediate and remarkable. Victoria's first meeting with her Privy Council demonstrated a poise and authority that surprised even her most experienced advisors. She entered the council chamber with measured steps, her small stature somehow commanding the room filled with distinguished gentlemen who had served her predecessors. Her voice, clear and steady, carried across the chamber as she took the oath of allegiance and addressed her new government with confidence that belied her youth and inexperience. And so begins the reign of Queen Victoria, a young woman barely out of childhood who would guide her nation and empire through 6 decades of unprecedented expansion and transformation. But that story unfolds gently, in its own time, as the hours of this peaceful night draw on and carry you softly towards sleep. The empire awaits, vast and full of stories yet to tell, and we shall explore them together in the quiet hours ahead. The young queen's daily routine underwent a complete transformation in those first weeks of her reign. Her mornings now began at dawn with briefings from her private secretary, who would present the most pressing matters requiring royal attention. The secretary would arrive carrying leather portfolios stuffed with documents, his footsteps echoing in the empty corridors of Buckingham Palace as the household staff prepared for another day of governance. Dispatches from across the empire arrived daily, bringing news of challenges and opportunities from territories she had only read about in her geography lessons. Reports from India described the complex relationships between British officials and local rulers, the delicate dance of authority and diplomacy that maintained order across a subcontinent of hundreds of millions. The paper spoke of Maharajas, who lived in palaces of marble and gold, of temples older than any cathedral in England, of languages and customs that differed from valley to valley. Letters from Canada outlined the delicate balance required to govern French and English populations side by side, communities that shared the same harsh land but maintained distinct identities, speaking different languages and practicing different faiths while somehow coexisting under the British Crown. Victoria's breakfast table became a centre of governance where she would review documents while sipping her morning tea. The tea itself came from plantations in Ceylon and Assam, a reminder with every cup of the empire's reach. Colonial governors sent detailed accounts of their territories, describing everything from trade statistics to local uprisings that required careful diplomatic handling. The Queen absorbed this information with remarkable attention to detail, asking probing questions that demonstrated her growing understanding of imperial administration. She wanted to know not just what was happening, but why, to understand the motivations and circumstances that drove events in these distant places. Her afternoons were devoted to audiences with ministers and ambassadors, each meeting requiring her to shift between different aspects of her vast responsibilities. She might discuss naval deployments in the Mediterranean with the First Lord of the Admiralty, then immediately turn to questions of Indian policy with representatives from the East India Company. The seamless transitions between these complex topics revealed Victoria's natural aptitude for the multifaceted nature of imperial governance. Her mind moved quickly from one subject to another, retaining details and making connections that sometimes escaped her more experienced advisors. The Queen's evening hours were spent in correspondence, her pen scratching across parchment as she wrote letters to colonial officials, European monarchs, and parliamentary leaders. The candles on her writing desk burned late into the night, their flickering light casting shadows across pages filled with her distinctive handwriting. She maintained detailed journals recording her thoughts on the various challenges facing her empire and developing her own perspectives on the best approaches to governance. These private writings revealed a monarch who was not content to simply approve the decisions of others, but who sought to understand and influence the forces shaping her realm. Within months of her accession, Victoria began asserting her authority in ways that surprised the political establishment. She insisted on reading all important documents personally rather than relying solely on ministerial summaries. When ministers arrived for meetings, they found themselves facing detailed questions that proved the Queen had thoroughly studied the materials they had submitted. Her inquiries during cabinet meetings demonstrated a grasp of policy details that exceeded what many had expected from someone so young and seemingly inexperienced in the ways of government. The Queen's approach to imperial expansion reflected both pragmatic calculation and genuine concern for her subjects' welfare. When reports arrived describing conflicts in Afghanistan, she demanded detailed explanations of British strategic interests, while also inquiring about the impact on local populations. Her correspondence with military commanders emphasized the importance of minimizing civilian casualties and respecting local customs wherever possible. Victoria understood that brutality might achieve short-term objectives but would create long-term problems, breeding resentment that could fester for generations. Victoria's fascination with the technological innovations transforming her empire led to regular meetings with engineers and inventors. She studied plans for railway construction across India, understanding how these iron roads would bind distant territories more closely to British administration. The Queen grasped how steam-powered communication could transform imperial governance, allowing her government to respond to distant crises with unprecedented speed. Where once it might take months to receive a report and send instructions back, now the time could be measured in weeks or even days. Her interest in social reform grew stronger as she received reports about working conditions in British factories and mines. Victoria read testimonies from parliamentary commissions investigating child labour, and her private letters revealed genuine distress about the hardships faced by her industrial subjects. She began supporting reform initiatives that would improve working conditions while maintaining the economic growth that funded imperial expansion. The Queen understood that prosperity at home provided the foundation for power abroad, that an empire built on the suffering of its own people could not long endure. The Queen's daily routine included regular consultations with military advisors who briefed her on the strategic challenges of defending such a vast empire. She studied maps showing British naval bases and troop deployments, understanding how the Royal Navy's dominance enabled Britain to project power across the world's oceans. Victoria grasped the delicate balance required to maintain security while avoiding the enormous costs that could bankrupt the treasury. Every ship, every garrison, every fortification represented resources that might be used elsewhere, and she learned to think strategically about where British power could be most effectively deployed. Her evenings often featured discussions with scholars and explorers who brought first-hand accounts of distant territories. Victoria listened intently to descriptions of African landscapes, Australian wilderness, and Indian cities, building a mental picture of the diverse populations and environments under her rule. These conversations informed her understanding of the cultural sensitivities required for effective imperial administration. She learned that what worked in one place might fail completely in another, that successful governance required flexibility and attention to local circumstances. The Queen's approach to diplomatic relations reflected her growing confidence in Britain's global position. She received foreign ambassadors with careful attention to protocol, understanding how these ceremonial interactions could influence international relationships. Victoria's correspondence with European monarchs combined personal warmth with subtle assertions of British interests, demonstrating her skill at blending friendship with statecraft. She learned to write letters that expressed genuine affection while advancing the empire's strategic objectives, a delicate balance that required both emotional intelligence and political acumen. As 1838 progressed, Victoria's transformation from sheltered princess to confident monarch became increasingly evident to those around her. She had developed her own perspectives on imperial policy, often challenging ministerial recommendations with well-informed alternatives. The Queen's daily schedule expanded to accommodate the growing demands of governing an empire where the sun never set, yet she maintained remarkable energy and attention to detail in all her duties. Her personal study became a command center for imperial administration, filled with maps, reports, and correspondence from every corner of her dominions. Victoria would spend hours reviewing these materials, developing her understanding of how local conditions in distant territories affected broader imperial interests. She began formulating her own vision of how the British Empire should develop, combining expansion with responsible governance, understanding that power brought both opportunities and obligations. The young Queen's evenings were increasingly devoted to planning for the future of her empire. She studied demographic reports showing population growth in various colonies, understanding how these trends would affect economic development. Victoria grasped the importance of education and infrastructure in building loyalty among colonial populations, supporting initiatives that would improve living conditions while strengthening imperial bonds. She saw that the empire could not be maintained through force alone, that it required the willing cooperation of millions who saw benefits in British rule. Her correspondence with colonial officials revealed a monarch who was deeply engaged with the practical challenges of imperial administration. Victoria asked detailed questions about tax collection, judicial systems, and military recruitment, demonstrating her commitment to understanding every aspect of governance. She insisted on regular reports that would keep her informed about conditions throughout her empire, refusing to remain distant from the realities facing her subject. The Queen wanted to know when harvests failed and people went hungry, when diseases struck and medical care proved inadequate, when tensions rose between different communities under British rule. As her first year as Queen drew to a close, Victoria had established herself as a hands-on monarch who intended to play an active role in shaping her empire's destiny. The quiet princess who had once traced coastlines on classroom maps was now directing the policies that would determine how British influence spread across those same territories. Her daily routine reflected the complexity of governing a global empire, while maintaining the delicate balance between authority and responsibility. The coronation of Queen Victoria on June 28, 1838, marked not merely the crowning of a young monarch, but the symbolic birth of an empire that would come to dominate the globe. As dawn broke over Westminster Abbey that summer morning, the ancient stone seemed to whisper of the momentous transformation about to unfold. The 18-year-old queen had spent the night in restless preparation, her mind racing through the ceremonies that would formally invest her with powers that reached across oceans and continents. Victoria rose before the sun, her ladies-in-waiting moving silently around her chambers as they prepared the elaborate coronation robes. The fabrics rustled and whispered as they were arranged, heavy silks and ermines that had dressed monarchs for centuries. The St. Edward's crown waited in the Tower of London, its ancient gold and precious stones soon to rest upon the head of a sovereign whose dominion would stretch farther than any who had worn it before. The young queen stood before her mirror, watching as layers of cloth transformed her from a nervous young woman into the living embodiment of imperial majesty. The procession through London streets revealed the genuine affection her subjects already felt for their new sovereign. Thousands lined the route from Buckingham Palace to Westminster Abbey, their cheers echoing off the buildings as Victoria's golden state coach rolled slowly through the city. The air smelled of summer flowers and coal smoke, of the Thames and the crowds of humanity pressed together to witness history. The Queen sat rigidly upright, her small hands folded carefully in her lap, acknowledging the crowds with subtle nods that conveyed both dignity and warmth. Inside Westminster Abbey, nearly 8,000 guests filled every available space, their silk gowns and military uniforms creating a tapestry of color beneath the soaring Gothic arches. Light filtered through stained glass windows, casting patterns of crimson and gold across the ancient stones. Victoria walked down the aisle with measured steps, her train held by 8 daughters of dukes and earls, each step carrying her closer to a destiny that would reshape the world. The ancient ceremony proceeded with careful precision, each ritual connecting her to centuries of royal tradition, while preparing her for challenges no previous monarch had faced. When the Archbishop of Canterbury placed the crown upon Victoria's head, the weight was both literal and symbolic. The young queen felt the physical pressure of the ancient circlet, gold and jewels pressing against her temples, but also sensed the immense responsibilities now resting upon her shoulders. In that moment she became not just Queen of the United Kingdom, but sovereign of territories whose full extent was still being discovered by explorers and adventurers pushing the boundaries of the known world. The months following her coronation saw Victoria settling into the rhythms of imperial governance with remarkable efficiency. Her mornings began in the Blue Room at Buckingham Palace, where her private secretary would present the most urgent correspondence from across her dominions. The room faced east, catching the early light that streamed through tall windows and illuminated the maps and papers spread across her desk. Letters arrived from governors-general in Canada and Australia describing the challenges of administering territories larger than all of Europe combined. Reports from India detailed the complex relationships between British officials and the hundreds of princely states that maintained nominal independence while accepting British oversight. The subcontinent was not a single unified territory but a patchwork of kingdoms and provinces, each with its own traditions and rulers, all gradually being woven into the fabric of British administration. Before a burst, Victoria learned the names of Maharajas and Nizams, studied maps showing the territories they controlled, and began to understand the delicate diplomacy required to maintain British supremacy without constant military intervention. Victoria's breakfast conversations with her ministers revealed her growing grasp of imperial strategy. She understood that British power rested not merely on military might, but on the intricate web of commercial relationships that connected London to markets across the globe. The Queen studied trade statistics with the same attention she once devoted to her childhood lessons, recognizing that cotton from America, tea from China, and spices from India formed the economic foundation of her empire's strength. Her daily routine included regular consultations with the First Lord of the Admiralty, who would spread naval charts across her desk to illustrate Britain's growing maritime dominance. Victoria traced the routes of Royal Navy squadrons patrolling distant waters, understanding how these ships protected British merchants while projecting imperial power to potential rivals. She grasped the strategic importance of coaling stations and naval bases that allowed British vessels to operate effectively in every ocean, from the Caribbean to the Indian Ocean, from the Mediterranean to the South Pacific. The Queen's afternoons were devoted to audiences with returning colonial officials, who brought first-hand accounts of life in distant territories. She listened intently to descriptions of Canadian lumber camps where men worked through brutal winters cutting timber for British shipyards, Australian sheep stations where vast flocks grazed on land that seemed to stretch forever, and Indian tea plantations where British planters cultivated the crop that had become essential to daily life throughout the empire. These conversations informed her approach to policy decisions that would affect millions of subjects she would never meet, but whose welfare she considered her personal responsibility. Victoria began to see the empire not as an abstraction but as a living network of communities, each with its own character and challenges, all connected through bonds of commerce, administration, and shared allegiance to the crown. Victoria's evening hours were spent in her private study, surrounded by maps and documents that illustrated the growing complexity of imperial administration. The room smelled of leather bindings and lamp oil, of paper and ink, and the faint traces of coal smoke that filtered in from the London air. She maintained detailed correspondence with colonial governors, offering guidance on local challenges while ensuring that distant territories remained aligned with broader imperial objectives. Her letters revealed a monarch who understood that effective governance required balancing central authority with local autonomy, allowing colonial officials sufficient flexibility to address unique regional circumstances. What worked in the temperate climate of Canada might prove disastrous in tropical India. What satisfied the French-speaking inhabitants of Quebec might offend the English-speaking settlers of Ontario. Victoria learned to think in terms of particular circumstances rather than universal rules. The Queen's approach to expansion reflected careful calculation rather than reckless ambition. When opportunities arose to extend British influence into new territories, Victoria insisted on thorough analysis of potential costs and benefits. She supported expansion that would enhance British security or economic interests, but opposed adventures that might drain imperial resources without providing substantial advantages. Her ministers learned to present colonial proposals with detailed justifications that addressed both strategic and financial considerations. Victoria's daily schedule increasingly reflected the global nature of her responsibilities. She might begin her morning reviewing reports from Hong Kong about tensions with Chinese authorities over trade restrictions and diplomatic protocol, then shift to discussions about railway construction in India that would connect the great cities of the subcontinent through ribbons of steel, followed by consultations about territorial disputes in Africa, where British explorers were beginning to penetrate the interior. The seamless transitions between these diverse topics demonstrated her remarkable ability to master complex information while maintaining focus on overarching imperial objectives. Her mind moved quickly from one subject to another, retaining details about each while understanding how they interconnected. A decision about tariffs in one colony might affect trade patterns throughout the empire. A military deployment to secure one territory might create vulnerabilities elsewhere. Her personal interest in technological innovation led to regular meetings with engineers and inventors whose creations were transforming imperial communication and transportation. Victoria studied plans for telegraph cables that would connect London to distant territories in minutes rather than months, understanding how rapid communication would revolutionize colonial administration. Messages that once required months of travel could now be transmitted almost instantaneously, allowing for coordination and control that would have seemed miraculous to previous generations. She supported railway projects that would bind scattered territories together while opening new regions to British commercial penetration. The railways were more than mere transportation systems. They were instruments of power that could move troops rapidly to trouble spots, carry administrators to remote regions, and open previously inaccessible territories to trade and settlement. Victoria understood that the empire of the future would be an empire connected by steel rails and copper wires, bound together by technology as much as by ships and soldiers. The Queen's concern for her subjects' welfare extended throughout her empire, leading to support for educational and medical initiatives in colonial territories. She funded schools and hospitals in India and Africa, recognizing that improving local conditions would strengthen imperial bonds while fulfilling her moral obligations as sovereign. Victoria's correspondence with missionaries and educators revealed genuine interest in the welfare of populations whose languages and customs differed dramatically from her own experience. She wanted to know whether children were learning to read, whether diseases were being treated, where the British rule was bringing tangible improvements to daily life. The Queen understood that an empire based solely on extraction and exploitation could not endure, that sustainable imperial power required providing benefits as well as demanding obedience. Her evening meetings with military commanders focused on the strategic challenges of defending such vast territories with limited resources. Victoria studied deployment patterns that maximized British military effectiveness while minimizing costs, understanding that imperial expansion required careful balance between ambition and available means. Every soldier stationed in India was a soldier unavailable for service elsewhere. Every pound spent on fortifications in one colony was a pound that could not be invested in infrastructure. She supported military reforms that would improve efficiency, while maintaining the professional standards that made British forces effective in diverse environments. The Queen learned about new weapons being developed, new tactics being tested, and new approaches to training that would prepare soldiers for the unique challenges of imperial service. Fighting in the mountains of Afghanistan required different skills than campaigning in the jungles of Burma or the veldt of southern Africa. The Queen's daily routine included regular reviews of intelligence reports from across her empire, keeping her informed about potential threats to British interests. She learned to identify patterns in seemingly unrelated events, understanding how local disturbances in one territory might affect stability elsewhere. A rebellion in one province might inspire imitators in another. A famine in one region might send refugees flooding into neighboring territories, creating humanitarian crises and political instabilities. Victoria's grasp of imperial interconnections enabled her to anticipate challenges and coordinate responses that addressed root causes rather than merely symptoms. She understood that treating symptoms might bring temporary relief but would not prevent future problems. The empire required long-term thinking, strategic vision that looked beyond immediate crises to underlying conditions and trends. Her approach to diplomatic relations reflected Britain's growing global influence. As Victoria received ambassadors from nations seeking British support or attempting to limit British expansion, she conducted these meetings with careful attention to protocol while subtly asserting British interests. Every conversation was both personal and political, combining courtesy with calculation. An ambassador might leave feeling that he had made a friend in the young Queen, only to discover later that British policy had shifted in ways that served London's interests at his nation's expense. The Queen's correspondence with foreign monarchs combined personal relationships with strategic calculations that advanced imperial objectives. She wrote warm letters to cousins and relatives who sat on thrones across Europe, letters filled with family news and expressions of affection. But woven through the personal content were subtle references to commercial agreements, territorial boundaries, and diplomatic alignments that served Britain's imperial ambitions. As 1839 unfolded, Victoria's mastery of imperial governance became increasingly evident to those around her. She had developed comprehensive understanding of how distant territories contributed to British wealth and security, while also grasping the responsibilities that empire imposed upon her government. The Queen's daily decisions affected populations from the Arctic to the tropics, requiring her to balance competing interests while maintaining the delicate equilibrium that sustained British dominance. Her personal study had become the nerve center of global empire, where information from every continent converged for royal consideration. Victoria spent her evenings analyzing reports that revealed both opportunities and challenges facing British interests worldwide. She began formulating long-term strategies that would guide imperial development for decades to come, understanding that her decisions would determine whether the British Empire would continue expanding or begin the slow process of decline that had claimed previous empires throughout history. The transformation from sheltered princess to imperial sovereign was now complete, but Victoria understood that her greatest challenges lay ahead. The British Empire stood at the threshold of unprecedented expansion, with opportunities emerging in Africa, Asia, and the Pacific that would test every aspect of imperial capability. The young Queen, who had once memorized geography lessons, was now directing the policies that would determine how those distant lands would be incorporated into the greatest empire the world had ever seen. The early months of 1840 brought whispers of romance to the corridors of Buckingham Palace as courtiers noticed the young Queen's particular interest in her German cousin, Prince Albert of Saxe-Coburg-Gotha. Victoria would spend her mornings reviewing correspondence with unusual attention whenever letters bearing the Coburg seal arrived among her official dispatches. The letters came on thick cream paper sealed with red wax, and the Queen would break the seal carefully, unfolding the pages with anticipation that was evident to anyone watching. Would be even more simplistic. Her ladies-in-waiting observed how she would set aside matters of state to read these personal messages, a soft smile crossing her face as she absorbed news from the principality where her future consort was completing his education. The smile transformed her usually serious expression, revealing the young woman beneath the sovereign. She would read passages aloud sometimes, sharing observations about art or music that Albert had included, her voice carrying a warmth rarely heard when she discussed governmental affairs. Prince Albert arrived in London on a crisp October morning, his carriage wheels echoing across the palace courtyard as Victoria watched from her window above. She had spent the early hours in careful preparation, her dresses arranging her hair with particular attention while selecting a gown of deep blue silk that complemented her dark eyes. The Queen understood that this meeting would determine not merely her personal happiness, but the future direction of the monarchy itself. A royal marriage was never simply a matter of affection, but a strategic alliance that could strengthen or weaken the empire's position in European politics. Their first private audience took place in the White Drawing Room, where afternoon sunlight filtered through tall windows to illuminate the young couple's conversation. The room glowed with golden light that caught the gilt frames of portraits in the crystal drops of chandeliers. Victoria found herself captivated by Albert's serious demeanor and his thoughtful observations about art, music, and literature. Here was a companion who could match her intellectual curiosity while bringing perspectives shaped by continental European experience. Their discussions ranged from philosophy to politics, each exchange revealing shared interests that transcended the formal requirements of royal courtship. They talked about Goethe and Schiller, about Italian opera and German symphonies, about the responsibility of rulers to their subjects and the challenges of governing in an age of rapid change. Albert spoke with quiet intelligence, his observations revealing depth of thought that impressed the young Queen. Within days of Albert's arrival, Victoria had reached her decision. The Queen summoned him to her private study on October 15th, where she would break with centuries of tradition by proposing marriage herself. Constitutional law required that she, as sovereign, must be the one to make the offer rather than accept a proposal from her suitor. The moment was both intimate and historic, as Victoria spoke the words that would transform not only her personal life, but the very nature of royal partnership in governing an expanding empire. Their wedding on February 10, 1841, at the Chapel Royal in St. James's Palace established new traditions that would influence royal ceremonies for generations. Victoria chose to wear white silk satin rather than the traditional silver and gold, creating a fashion that would spread throughout her empire as brides everywhere adopted the royal example. The dress was simple yet elegant, trimmed with Oniton lace that had been specially commissioned from Devon craftswomen. Prince Albert stood beside her in the uniform of a British field marshal, symbolizing his new role as consort to the sovereign of territories spanning every continent. The chapel was filled with nobility and dignitaries, but for Victoria the only person in the room was Albert, whose steady presence gave her confidence and comfort. The ceremony joined not just two people but two complementary natures, Victoria's passionate intensity balanced by Albert's calm rationality. The marriage immediately transformed the daily rhythms of palace life as Albert brought Germanic efficiency and methodical organization to the somewhat chaotic atmosphere that had characterized Victoria's early reign. The prince consort established regular schedules for meals, audiences, and correspondence that maximized the Queen's effectiveness while ensuring adequate time for the personal relationship that anchored their partnership. Their breakfast conversations became informal cabinet meetings, where Victoria could test ideas with someone who understood both her personal nature. The morning meal was served at precisely 8 o'clock, and they would discuss the day's agenda while eating toast and drinking coffee. Albert would have already reviewed the overnight dispatches, and he would summarize the most important developments, while Victoria listened and asked questions, the two of them working through problems together before facing the demands of the official day. Albert's influence on imperial policy became apparent within months of their marriage, as his systematic approach to problem-solving complemented Victoria's intuitive grasp of political relationships. The prince consort would spend his mornings reviewing colonial reports with the same methodical attention he had once devoted to his university studies, preparing detailed analyses that helped the Queen understand complex situations in distant territories. His continental perspective proved valuable in assessing European reactions to British expansion, enabling more sophisticated diplomatic strategies. The royal couple's daily routine included joint audiences with colonial officials, where Albert's probing questions often revealed aspects of imperial administration that might otherwise have escaped attention. He possessed a gift for identifying connections between seemingly unrelated problems, helping Victoria understand how challenges in one territory might affect stability throughout her empire. Their evening discussions became strategic planning sessions where they would analyze intelligence reports and correspondence from governors-general across their dominions. Victoria's pregnancy in late 1840 added new dimensions to imperial governance as the Queen had to balance her expanding family responsibilities with the demands of ruling territories where rebellions, natural disasters, and diplomatic crises required immediate attention. She continued her morning routine of reviewing dispatches from across the empire, though now she might pause to rest her hand on her growing abdomen while contemplating how her decisions would affect the world her children would inherit. The birth of Princess Victoria Adelaide Mary Louise on November 21, 1840, marked the beginning of a royal dynasty that would shape imperial development for the remainder of the century. The Queen held her newborn daughter while reviewing reports from India, understanding that this child might one day inherit an empire even larger than the one currently under her rule. The infant princess slept peacefully in her mother's arms, unaware that her cradle songs were accompanied by discussions of territorial expansion and colonial administration. Albert's role as prince consort evolved rapidly as he assumed increasing responsibilities for managing the administrative aspects of imperial governance. His mornings were spent in detailed correspondence with colonial officials, providing them with guidance that reflected both his own analytical capabilities. The prince consort became an extension of royal authority, enabling Victoria to maintain personal oversight of imperial affairs while also attending to her growing family responsibilities. The royal nursery at Buckingham Palace became an unlikely centre of imperial planning, as Victoria would often conduct business while nursing her children or supervising their early education. She understood that these future princes and princesses would need comprehensive understanding of the empire they might one day help govern, leading her to ensure that even their childhood games included references to distant territories and diverse populations under British rule. Victoria's daily schedule expanded to accommodate the complex demands of motherhood and imperial sovereignty, requiring careful coordination between personal and public responsibilities. She might spend her morning reviewing military dispatches from Afghanistan, while her infant daughter played at her feet, then shift to consultations with the Governor-General of Canada while directing the children's afternoon lessons. The seamless integration of family life and imperial governance created new models for royal behavior that would influence monarchical traditions throughout Europe. The Queen's approach to expansion during this period reflected both increased confidence and growing caution, as she recognized that imperial adventures could affect not only her subjects but her own children's future security. Victoria supported territorial acquisitions that would strengthen British strategic positions while providing her descendants with secure foundations for continued leadership. Her correspondence with colonial governors emphasized the importance of establishing stable institutions that could maintain British influence across generations. And Albert's systematic approach to imperial intelligence gathering created new efficiencies in colonial administration, as the prince consort established regular reporting schedules that ensured comprehensive information flow from distant territories. His morning routine included detailed analysis of these reports, identifying patterns and trends that might escape notice in the daily rush of crisis management. The prince consort's summaries became essential reading for cabinet ministers responsible for colonial affairs. The royal couple's evening hours were devoted to long-term strategic planning, as they recognized that the empire's continued expansion required careful consideration of geographic, economic, and political factors that would determine future success or failure. Victoria and Albert would spread maps across their private study floor, tracing potential railway routes through India or discussing the strategic implications of territorial acquisitions in Africa. These intimate planning sessions shaped policies that would affect millions of people across multiple continents. Their joint approach to imperial governance created unprecedented coordination between royal authority and administrative efficiency, as Albert's methodical preparation enabled Victoria to make informed decisions with remarkable speed and accuracy. Colonial officials learned to expect rapid responses to their requests, as the royal partnership could process complex information and formulate comprehensive policies faster than traditional governmental procedures had allowed. The Queen's growing family provided new perspectives on imperial responsibilities as Victoria began considering how territorial expansion and colonial development would affect the world her children would inherit. She supported educational initiatives throughout the empire, understanding that stable colonial societies would provide better foundations for her descendants' future leadership. The royal nursery's lessons increasingly included geography and languages that would prepare the young princes and princesses for their roles in governing diverse populations. Victoria's daily correspondence expanded to include personal letters to colonial officials' wives, creating informal networks of communication that supplemented official governmental channels. These relationships provided insights into social conditions throughout the empire, helping the Queen understand how British rule affected families and communities in distant territories. Her evening hours often included responses to these personal letters, maintaining connections that humanized imperial relationships. As 1842 approached, the royal couple had established new paradigms for imperial governance that combined personal partnership with systematic administration. Their daily routines reflected the global nature of British responsibilities, while maintaining the intimate family relationships that anchored their authority. Victoria and Albert had transformed the monarchy into an efficient instrument of imperial expansion, creating foundations for territorial acquisitions and administrative reforms that would characterize the remainder of the 19th century. The empire stood poised for unprecedented growth, with opportunities emerging in Asia, Africa, and the Pacific. Victoria's morning reviews of colonial correspondence revealed both the challenges and possibilities that lay ahead as British influence continued spreading across territories whose full potential remained to be discovered and developed. The dawn of 1842 found Queen Victoria in her private chambers, cradling her second child, Prince Albert Edward, while simultaneously reviewing dispatches that would reshape the map of Asia. The infant prince, future King Edward VII, slept peacefully against his mother's shoulder as she read reports from the First Opium War that had concluded just months earlier. The Treaty of Nanking lay spread across her writing desk, its terms opening Chinese ports to British commerce and ceding Hong Kong to the Crown in perpetuity. Victoria's morning routine now included feeding her children while absorbing intelligence from the Far East, where British merchants were establishing trading posts along the Chinese coast. The reports described a vast empire humbled by superior British military technology, ancient traditions forced to accommodate Western commercial demands. She would gently rock Prince Albert Edward while studying maps that showed the new territories acquired through diplomatic negotiation backed by military pressure. The Queen understood that these distant acquisitions represented more than commercial opportunities. They were stepping stones for British influence across the Pacific Ocean, positions from which the empire could extend its reach into markets that had remained closed for centuries. The ancient porcelain empire of China, with its silks and teas and traditions stretching back millennia, was opening to British trade whether it wished to or not. Her breakfast conversations with Prince Albert increasingly focused on the strategic implications of territorial expansion in multiple directions simultaneously. While one hand held her teacup, the other would trace shipping routes on charts, showing how goods from India could now flow through Hong Kong to reach markets throughout Asia. The Prince Consort would present carefully analyzed reports about population centers, natural resources, and local political structures in newly acquired territories, his methodical mind organizing information that might otherwise overwhelm less systematic thinkers. The royal couple's daily walks through the palace gardens became mobile strategy sessions, as they discussed the challenges of administering territories. Victoria would pause beside rose bushes heavy with summer blooms, their fragrance filling the warm air, to consider how British legal systems might be adapted to local customs. The scent of roses mixed with the earthier smell of boxwood hedges and freshly cut grass as they walked the gravel paths. Albert calculated the costs of establishing governmental infrastructure in regions that lacked European-style administrative traditions. How many administrators would be needed? What salaries would attract qualified men to positions so far from home? What systems of communication and transportation would enable effective oversight? These practical questions required practical answers, and the prince consort applied himself to finding them with characteristic thoroughness. Their afternoon audiences with returning colonial officials brought vivid descriptions of life in territories that existed only as names on maps to most British citizens. Victoria listened intently as merchants described the bustling streets of Bombay where British and Indian traders negotiated deals that enriched both communities. The merchants spoke of bazaars filled with spices and textiles, of languages mixing in commercial exchanges, of money flowing through channels that connected village weavers to London buyers. Military officers provided detailed accounts of frontier regions where British authority was still being established through careful diplomacy backed by the implicit threat of superior firepower. They described negotiations with local chieftains, ceremonies where gifts were exchanged and promises made, the delicate dance of establishing authority without provoking resistance that would require expensive military campaigns. The Queen's evening correspondence expanded to include letters from governors and administrators throughout Asia, each message requiring careful consideration of how local decisions might affect broader imperial interests. She would sit in her private study with Prince Albert Edward sleeping in a cradle beside her desk, reviewing reports that described everything from tax collection procedures to educational initiatives designed to create loyalty among diverse populations. The soft breathing of her sleeping son provided a gentle counterpoint to the weighty matters she contemplated. How should opium revenues be managed? What role should British officials play in local disputes? Should traditional courts be maintained or replaced with British legal institutions? Each question opened onto others, creating complex webs of policy considerations that required wisdom beyond her years. Victoria's approach to expansion during this period reflected growing sophistication about the complexities of governing culturally diverse territories across vast distances. Her morning briefings included detailed discussions about religious sensitivities, traditional authority structures, and economic systems that required careful integration with British administrative practice. The Queen insisted on regular reports about local reactions to British rule, understanding that sustainable expansion required acceptance rather than mere submission. The royal nursery became an unlikely center of imperial intelligence, as Victoria would often conduct important meetings while supervising her children's early education. Foreign ambassadors learned to expect informal audiences, where diplomatic negotiations might be interrupted by the needs of nursing infants or the questions of curious toddlers. A visiting dignitary might find himself discussing trade agreements while the Queen simultaneously directed her daughter's drawing lesson or soothed a fretful baby. These domestic settings paradoxically enhanced the Queen's authority, demonstrating her ability to balance multiple complex responsibilities. The ambassadors saw a monarch who could shift seamlessly from maternal tenderness to political calculation, who could nurse a child while negotiating terms that would affect millions of lives in distant territories. Prince Albert's systematic approach to colonial administration created new efficiencies in managing information flows from territories spanning multiple time zones. His morning routine included careful review of overnight telegrams from India, afternoon dispatches from Australia, and evening reports from Canadian territories. The flow never ceased, information pouring into London from every direction, requiring constant attention and rapid processing. The Prince Consort developed innovative filing systems that enabled rapid access to relevant information when crises required immediate royal attention. He organized documents by territory, by subject, by urgency, creating a bureaucratic infrastructure that could handle the empire's growing complexity. Where previous administrations had relied on memory and chance, Albert introduced method and system. The Queen's daily schedule reflected the accelerating pace of imperial expansion as opportunities emerged faster than traditional governmental procedures could process them. Victoria learned to make crucial decisions about territorial acquisitions and administrative appointments, while managing the practical demands of raising young children who would eventually inherit the consequences of her choices. Her ability to shift seamlessly between maternal duties and imperial strategy impressed even experienced ministers who struggled to match her mental agility. Their joint approach to expansion emphasized careful preparation and systematic implementation rather than impulsive territorial acquisition. Victoria and Albert would spend their evenings analyzing detailed reports about potential new territories, considering not only immediate strategic benefits but also long-term implications for imperial stability and development. They understood that hasty expansion could create administrative burdens that might ultimately weaken rather than strengthen British power. The royal couple's breakfast discussions increasingly focused on the technological innovations that were transforming imperial communication and transportation. Steam-powered ships could now carry messages and supplies between London and distant territories in weeks rather than months, while telegraph lines were beginning to connect major colonial centres to enable rapid coordination of policy decisions. The copper wires hummed with messages that crossed continents in hours, collapsing distances that had once seemed insurmountable. Victoria grasped how these innovations would revolutionize imperial governance by enabling more direct oversight of distant administrators. No longer could a colonial governor make decisions and wait months for approval or correction. Now London could respond quickly, could guide and direct and control with unprecedented immediacy. This centralization of authority had profound implications for how the empire would be governed. Her morning routine included careful study of engineering reports describing railway construction projects that would bind scattered territories together while opening new regions to British commercial penetration. The Queen traced proposed rail routes across maps of India, understanding how these iron roads would transform both military strategy and economic development throughout the subcontinent. A railway could move troops to trouble spots in days rather than weeks, could carry goods from interior regions to coastal ports, could connect populations that had previously lived in isolation. She supported infrastructure investments that would strengthen imperial bonds while generating revenue to fund further expansion. Victoria saw that railways were not merely transportation systems but instruments of transformation, changing everything they touched. Villages along railway lines would grow into towns. Farmers would gain access to distant markets. Traditional patterns of life would shift as the wider world rushed in along steel tracks. Victoria's afternoon audiences with merchants and explorers brought first-hand accounts of territories that remained largely unknown to European geographers. She listened to descriptions of African kingdoms, South American republics, and Pacific islands, where British influence was beginning to penetrate through commercial relationships and diplomatic initiatives. These conversations informed her understanding of how expansion might proceed in regions that lacked established governmental structures. The merchants spoke of opportunities and obstacles, of potential profits and practical difficulties. Explorers described landscapes of extraordinary beauty and danger, populations both welcoming and hostile, resources waiting to be developed. Each account added detail to Victoria's mental map of a world still largely unknown to European eyes. The Queen's evening correspondence included personal letters to colonial officials' families, creating informal networks of communication that supplemented official governmental channels. These relationships provided insights into social conditions throughout the empire, helping Victoria understand how British rule affected daily life in distant communities. Her responses demonstrated genuine concern for the welfare of subjects she would never meet, but whose loyalty she considered essential for imperial stability. She asked about children's health and education, about housing and food supplies, about the challenges of adapting to unfamiliar climates and cultures. These personal touches created bonds of affection that went beyond formal duty, making colonial service feel less like exile and more like participation in a great shared enterprise. Prince Albert's role as royal consort evolved to include direct oversight of colonial intelligence operations, as his analytical skills proved valuable for identifying patterns in seemingly unrelated events across different territories. The prince consort would spend his mornings correlating reports from various sources, looking for connections that might indicate emerging threats or opportunities requiring royal attention. His summaries became essential reading for ministers responsible for imperial policy. He noticed when unrest in one region coincided with harvest failures in another, when diplomatic tensions aligned with shifts in trade patterns, when seemingly local problems reflected broader systemic issues. This pattern recognition enabled proactive rather than reactive governance, allowing problems to be addressed before they became crises. The royal couple's daily routine included joint review of military deployment patterns as they recognized that effective defense of such vast territories required strategic positioning of limited forces to maximum advantage. Victoria would study troop disposition charts while nursing her children, understanding that military decisions made in London could determine the success or failure of British authority in regions. Every regiment had to be positioned with care. Too many troops in one location meant vulnerability elsewhere. Too few in a trouble spot risked losing control. The balance required constant adjustment as circumstances shifted and new threats emerged. Their approach to diplomatic relations reflected Britain's growing global influence, as Victoria received ambassadors from nations seeking British support or attempting to limit British expansion. She conducted these meetings with careful attention to protocol while subtly asserting British interests, understanding that diplomatic success often determined whether expansion would proceed peacefully. The Queen's correspondence with foreign monarchs combined personal relationships with strategic calculations that advanced imperial objectives. She wrote to cousins and relatives across Europe, letters filled with family news and expressions of affection. But woven through the personal content were references to trade agreements, territorial boundaries, and diplomatic alignments that served British interests. As 1843 unfolded, Victoria's mastery of imperial governance enabled her to manage expanding responsibilities while maintaining the personal relationships that anchored royal authority. Her daily decisions affected populations from the Arctic to the equator, requiring careful balance between competing interests while preserving the delicate equilibrium that sustained British dominance. The Queen had transformed from a young mother learning to govern into a confident sovereign directing the expansion of history's largest empire. Her private study had evolved into a command center, where information from every continent converged for royal analysis. While the royal nursery provided constant reminder that imperial decisions would determine the world her children would inherit, Victoria spent her evenings formulating policies that would guide British expansion for decades to come, understanding that her choices would establish precedents affecting generations of subjects throughout her growing empire. The candles burned late in her study as she worked through correspondence and reports, her pen moving steadily across page after page of official responses and personal letters. The morning routine that began with feeding her infants had expanded to include briefings about territorial acquisitions, trade negotiation, and military campaigns that were extending British influence into regions that had never experienced European authority. Victoria's ability to process complex information while managing family responsibilities demonstrated the remarkable adaptability that would characterize a long reign as sovereign of the greatest empire in human history. The gentle chimes of the palace clock tower marked the passing hours as Victoria's empire continued its relentless expansion across the globe. Each morning brought fresh dispatches from territories that seemed to multiply with each passing season, their names becoming familiar through constant repetition in royal correspondence. The Queen would rise at dawn to find her breakfast table laden not just with porridge and tea, but with reports from governors who administered populations larger than most European nations. In the spring of 1843, Victoria's morning ritual included nursing her youngest child while reviewing telegrams from Calcutta, where British administrators were implementing new taxation systems across the Bengal Presidency. The infant prince would gurgle contentedly against her shoulder as she absorbed details about railway construction projects that would connect the great cities of India through ribbons of steel and steam. These iron pathways represented more than mere transportation. They were the arteries through which British authority would pump life into the furthest reaches of the subcontinent, connecting mountain villages to coastal ports, allowing goods and people and ideas to flow with unprecedented freedom. The railways would transform India as profoundly as they were transforming Britain itself. A private secretary would enter the Blue Room precisely at 8 o'clock, his arms laden with leather portfolios containing the overnight correspondence from across the empire. Victoria would listen intently as he summarized the most pressing matters, from border disputes in Burma to trade negotiations in Singapore. The secretary's voice maintained a calm, measured tone regardless of the urgency of the news he conveyed. The Queen had developed a remarkable ability to shift her attention seamlessly between maternal duties and imperial strategy, often signing territorial annexation orders while simultaneously directing her children's morning lessons. She might review a governor's request for additional troops while ensuring that Princess Victoria practiced her piano scales correctly, or approve funding for a new harbour while helping Prince Albert Edward choose which toy soldiers to play with. The royal breakfast had evolved into an informal cabinet meeting where Prince Albert would present his careful analysis of colonial reports while Victoria fed her growing family. Their conversations ranged across continents as they discussed the challenges of governing territories, whose combined population now exceeded that of Europe itself. The prince consort's methodical approach complemented the Queen's intuitive understanding of political relationships, creating a partnership that could process vast amounts of information with unprecedented efficiency. They might discuss cotton cultivation in Egypt while buttering toast, shift to copper mining in Canada while pouring more tea, then move to wool production in Australia while clearing their plates. The domestic routine of breakfast became a framework for managing global responsibilities. The familiar rhythms of family meals grounding discussions of matters that affected millions of distant lives. Victoria's mid-morning routine included audiences with returning colonial officials, who brought first-hand accounts of life in territories that existed as mere dots on the maps covering her study walls. She would receive these visitors in the white drawing room where afternoon sunlight illuminated their weather-beaten faces as they described the realities of administering justice in regions where British law was still taking root among ancient customs and traditions. These meetings provided texture to the dry statistics that filled official reports. A governor might describe the ceremony where a local ruler accepted British protection, the elaborate rituals and gift exchanges that preceded the signing of treaties. An administrator might explain the challenges of collecting taxes in regions where money itself was still a novel concept, where people measured wealth in cattle or land rather than coins. Victoria absorbed these accounts with genuine fascination, understanding that successful expansion required adaptation rather than mere imposition of British practices upon unwilling populations. She learned that what worked in temperate Canada might fail completely in tropical Burma, that legal codes suitable for predominantly Christian populations required modification in Muslim or Hindu regions. Her correspondence during this period revealed growing sophistication in her approach to imperial governance, as letters to colonial governors emphasized the importance of respecting local sensitivities while maintaining the essential elements of British authority. The Queen insisted on regular reports about educational initiatives designed to create literate populations who could participate effectively in the expanding commercial networks that connected distant territories to London markets. Education became a cornerstone of imperial policy, the means by which British values and methods would be transmitted to subject populations. Victoria supported schools where Indian children learned English alongside their own languages, where African students studied British history and mathematics, where colonial populations gained skills that would make them valuable participants in the imperial economy. The afternoon hours found Victoria in her private study, surrounded by maps that illustrated the growing complexity of imperial administration. She would trace shipping routes with her finger while her children played quietly on the Persian carpets, their innocent games often incorporating the exotic names of territories their mother governed. The maps showed a world increasingly dominated by British red, territories shaded to indicate imperial controls, spreading across every continent. The royal nursery had become inadvertently educational as toy soldiers represented garrisons stationed from Gibraltar to Hong Kong, while picture books depicted landscapes from Canadian forests to Australian plains. The children grew up immersed in geography and empire, learning the names of distant places as naturally as they learned the rooms of the palace. Prince Albert's influence on colonial policy became increasingly evident, as his systematic approach to problem-solving transformed the chaotic information flows that had characterized earlier imperial administration. The prince consort established regular reporting schedules that ensured comprehensive coverage of developments throughout the empire, while his analytical summaries enabled Victoria to identify patterns that might otherwise escape notice in the daily rush of crisis management. He created standardized forms for colonial reports, ensuring that administrators provided consistent information that could be easily compared across territories. Established deadlines for submissions so that information arrived in predictable rhythms rather than random bursts. He organized the data so that Victoria could see at a glance how each territory was performing, where problems were emerging, and where opportunities might be seized. Their evening discussions had evolved into strategic planning sessions where they would analyze intelligence reports while the children slept peacefully in the nursery above. Victoria and Albert would spread charts across the study floor, examining potential trade routes through regions that remained largely unmapped by European explorers. These intimate conversations shaped policies that would affect millions of people across multiple continents, They spoke in quiet voices, mindful of the sleeping household around them. The discussions ranged widely, from the philosophical principles that should guide imperial governance to the practical details of water supply systems in arid colonies. No topic was too grand or too mundane for their consideration. Both understood that the empire's success depended on getting countless details right, on making good decisions large and small. As the royal couple balanced immediate practical concerns with long-term strategic objectives, the Queen's daily routine reflected the accelerating pace of territorial acquisition as opportunities emerged faster than traditional governmental procedures could accommodate them. Steam-powered communication was beginning to compress the vast distances that separated London from distant territories, enabling more direct oversight of colonial administrators, while creating expectations for rapid responses to local challenges and opportunities. Victoria's morning briefings increasingly included reports from territories whose names had been unknown to European geographers just years earlier. The systematic exploration of Africa was revealing kingdoms and resources that offered new possibilities for British expansion, while diplomatic initiatives in the Pacific were establishing relationships with island communities that could provide strategic bases for naval operations across the world's largest ocean. The reports described encounters with peoples living as their ancestors had lived for centuries, untouched by European civilization until British explorers arrived. Victoria read accounts of African kingdoms with sophisticated political systems, of Pacific islanders with remarkable navigational knowledge, of peoples whose ways of life differed fundamentally from anything in European experience. Her approach to expansion during this period emphasized careful preparation and gradual implementation, rather than dramatic territorial seizures that might provoke international opposition. Victoria supported initiatives that would establish British influence through commercial relationships and diplomatic agreements, understanding that sustainable expansion required local acceptance rather than mere military occupation. The royal couple's joint oversight of imperial intelligence operations created unprecedented coordination between different aspects of colonial administration, as Albert's methodical analysis enabled Victoria to understand connections between seemingly unrelated developments in distant territories. Their breakfast conversations might begin with reports from Canadian lumber camps and shift seamlessly to discussions of tea plantation management in Ceylon, as they grasped how economic relationships in one region affected stability throughout their growing empire. A shortage of timber in one place might create opportunities for suppliers elsewhere. A plague affecting tea crops in Ceylon might increase demand for Indian tea. A gold discovery in one colony might draw away workers from another. Everything connected to everything else in complex webs of cause and effect that required careful attention. Victoria's correspondence expanded to include personal letters to colonial officials' wives, creating informal networks of communication that provided insights into social conditions beyond the scope of official governmental reports. These relationships humanized imperial administration by connecting the Queen directly with families who were implementing British authority in communities that maintained their own cultural traditions and social structures. The wives wrote about their daily lives, the challenges of finding suitable housing, the difficulties of obtaining familiar foods, the loneliness of being far from family and friends. They described their interactions with local populations, friendships that formed across cultural boundaries, misunderstandings that required patient navigation. Victoria read these letters with interest, understanding that they revealed truths that official reports would never capture. The Queen's afternoon audiences with merchants and explorers brought vivid descriptions of territories that remained frontier regions, where British influence was still being established through patient negotiation with local leaders. She listened intently to accounts of diplomatic ceremonies where traditional rulers accepted British protection in exchange for commercial privileges, understanding that these agreements created foundations for gradual expansion of imperial authority. The ceremonies were often elaborate affairs, blending British and local traditions in ways that satisfied both parties. A British official might present gifts to a local ruler according to traditional protocols, while the ruler in turn might grant trading concessions using British legal language. These hybrid arrangements allowed both sides to claim success while establishing relationships that could deepen over time. Her evening hours were devoted to correspondence with military commanders who provided detailed assessments of the strategic challenges involved in defending such vast territories with limited resources. Victoria studied deployment patterns that maximized British military effectiveness while minimizing costs, recognizing that imperial expansion required careful balance between ambition and available means. Every soldier cost money to recruit, train, equip, transport, and maintain. Every garrison required supplies and support. The Empire's military resources were substantial but not unlimited, requiring constant prioritization and strategic positioning. Victoria learned to think like a general, considering lines of communication, supply routes, defensive positions, and potential threats. The royal nursery provided constant reminder that imperial decisions would determine the world her children would inherit, leading Victoria to support educational and infrastructure initiatives that would create stable foundations for continued British leadership. Her letters to colonial governors emphasized the importance of establishing institutions that could maintain imperial unity across generations while also accommodating the legitimate aspirations of diverse populations seeking opportunities for advancement within British systems. She wanted her children to inherit not just territories but stable, prosperous, well-governed territories where British rule was accepted. This required thinking beyond immediate control to long-term legitimacy, building systems that would endure, because they served the interests of colonial populations. Prince Albert's systematic approach to colonial administration enabled more effective coordination between different governmental departments responsible for imperial affairs, as his analytical capabilities helped identify potential conflicts between competing policies before they could create serious problems. The Prince Consort's morning routine included detailed review of interdepartmental correspondence, ensuring that decisions made in one ministry would not inadvertently undermine initiatives being pursued by another. He noticed when the War Office's troop movements conflicted with the Colonial Office's diplomatic initiatives, when the Treasury's budget constraints threatened infrastructure projects, when different departments pursued contradictory objectives. His coordinating role prevented many problems before they could develop into full-blown crises. Victoria's daily schedule had expanded to accommodate the complex demands of governing territories where local conditions varied dramatically from Arctic wilderness to tropical plantations. You might spend her morning reviewing reports about copper mining operations in Canada, then shift to discussions of cotton cultivation in Egypt, followed by consultations about diplomatic relations with Chinese authorities, who were adapting to expanded British commercial presence. The variety was extraordinary, requiring constant mental adjustment. The Queen learned to think simultaneously about ice and heat, mountains and deserts, forests and plains. She developed the ability to shift context instantly, to understand that what seemed obvious in one setting might be completely inappropriate in another. Their joint approach to imperial governance created new models for royal authority that combined traditional monarchical prerogatives with systematic administrative efficiency. Colonial officials learned to expect comprehensive guidance that reflected both the Queen's political instincts and the Prince Consort's analytical preparation, enabling more consistent implementation of imperial policies across diverse territorial environments. The combination of Victoria's emotional intelligence and Albert's methodical rationality proved remarkably effective. She understood people and politics, he understood systems and processes. Together they created an approach to governance that was both humane and efficient, principled and practical. The Queen's growing confidence in imperial matters enabled her to challenge ministerial recommendations when her own analysis suggested alternative approaches might prove more effective. Victoria's correspondence with cabinet members revealed a sovereign who understood the complexities of colonial administration well enough to offer substantive critiques of proposed policies, while her suggestions often proved superior to the original proposals. Ministers learned that Victoria was not a mere rubber stamp, but an active participant in policy formation. Her questions were pointed and informed, her objections were substantive, her alternatives were carefully thought through. The government worked better because the monarch actually governed, bringing her unique perspective and comprehensive knowledge to bear on imperial questions. As 1844 approached, the royal couple had established administrative systems that could accommodate continued territorial expansion while maintaining the personal oversight that ensured imperial policies reflected royal priorities. Victoria's morning routine of reviewing colonial correspondence while managing family responsibilities had become a model for balancing multiple complex duties, while Albert's systematic analysis provided the intellectual framework that transformed scattered information into coherent imperial strategy. The empire stood poised for another phase of unprecedented growth, with opportunities emerging in regions that would test every aspect of the governmental systems the royal couple had developed. Victoria's daily decisions continued to affect populations across every inhabited continent as British influence spread through networks of commerce, diplomacies, and gradual territorial acquisition that were reshaping the global balance of power in ways that would influence world history for generations to come. The morning mist clung to the Thames as Victoria entered the most transformative period of her reign, when the very concept of empire would evolve from scattered territories into a unified global system. The year 1845 dawned with unprecedented challenges that would test every administrative innovation she and Albert had carefully constructed. In her private chambers, the Queen would rise before the servants stirred, her mind already racing through the complex web of decisions that awaited her attention across 6 continents. The dawnlight was grey and soft, filtering through curtains that had been drawn against the night. Victoria would slip from her bed quietly, not wanting to wake Albert, and move to the window to look out over the sleeping city. London spread before her. Thousands of chimneys that would soon begin smoking as the city came to life, streets that would fill with carriages and pedestrians, markets that would open for another day of commerce. Her breakfast table had become a battlefield of competing priorities, where urgent telegrams from the northwest frontier of India lay beside equally pressing reports from the newly established colonies of New Zealand. Victoria would sip her morning tea while absorbing accounts of Maori resistance to British settlement, her free hand gently stroking the hair of her youngest child who slept peacefully in her lap. The reports from New Zealand described a complex situation where British settlers sought land that Maori tribes had occupied for centuries. The Maori were not primitive or easily dominated but sophisticated warriors with strong cultural traditions and legitimate claims to their territories. Finding equitable solutions required patience and sensitivity that not all British officials possessed. The juxtaposition of maternal tenderness and imperial authority had become the defining characteristic of her daily existence. Victoria could comfort a teething infant while contemplating military deployments, could nurse a baby while drafting instructions to a colonial governor. The domestic and the imperial, the intimate and the vast, existed simultaneously in her experience. The Queen's morning audiences now included a steady stream of explorers and missionaries returning from territories that existed beyond the edges of even the most detailed maps. She would receive these sun-weary adventurers in the green drawing room, where their tales of African kingdoms and Pacific archipelagos filled her imagination. David Livingstone would describe his encounters with tribal chieftains who ruled territories larger than Scotland, his voice carrying the enthusiasm of someone who had seen wonders that most people could scarcely imagine. His accounts of African rivers that flowed for hundreds of miles, waterfalls that dwarfed anything in Europe, and kingdoms with rich traditions and complex politics challenged European assumptions about African civilization. Naval officers presented charts of island chains that could serve as stepping stones for British influence across the world's most remote waters. They spoke of islands where fresh water could be obtained, where ships could shelter from storms, where coaling stations could be established to extend the range of steam-powered vessels. Each island represented a potential piece in the global puzzle of British naval supremacy. Victoria's correspondence during this period revealed her growing understanding of how cultural sensitivity could serve strategic purposes more effectively than military coercion. Her letters to colonial governors emphasized the importance of learning local languages and customs, recognizing that administrators who could communicate directly with indigenous populations would achieve better results than those who relied solely on interpreters and intimidation. She wrote detailed instructions about respecting religious practices, honoring traditional leaders, and working within existing social structures rather than attempting to impose entirely foreign systems. Victoria understood that people would more readily accept British authority if it accommodated rather than destroyed their ways of life. She supported the establishment of schools where British and local children learned together, understanding that educational integration would create loyalty more lasting than any imposed through force. These schools became testing grounds for imperial integration, places where children from different backgrounds played together, learned together, and formed friendships that might ease the tensions their parents experienced. The royal study had expanded to accommodate the flood of intelligence flowing from territories whose administration required increasingly sophisticated coordination. Maps covered every wall, their surfaces marked with colored pins representing military garrisons, commercial centers, and diplomatic missions that maintained British influence across regions, spanning multiple climate zones and cultural traditions. Victoria would spend her afternoons tracing trade routes with her finger while dictating responses to governors who sought guidance on everything from tax collection procedures to marriage laws that needed to accommodate both British legal principles and local customs. The marriage laws proved particularly complex, as different cultures had different traditions regarding polygamy, divorce, and inheritance that conflicted with British norms. Prince Albert's methodical approach to imperial administration had created new efficiencies that enabled more effective governance of territories whose combined area now exceeded that of Europe and Asia combined. His morning routine included detailed analysis of economic reports showing how raw materials from colonial territories were being transformed in British factories into manufactured goods that were then exported back to colonial markets. This pattern created cycles of dependency that strengthened imperial bonds while generating enormous profits for British merchants and investors. Cotton from India traveled to Manchester to be spun and woven, then returned to India as finished cloth. The Indians grew the cotton, but British mills captured most of the value in processing it. This economic relationship sustained British prosperity while keeping colonies in positions of dependency. The Queen's afternoon walks through the palace gardens had become mobile strategy sessions where she and Albert would discuss the delicate balance required to maintain imperial unity while accommodating the legitimate aspirations of diverse populations, seeking greater self-governance. They understood that successful long-term administration required gradual transfer of certain responsibilities to local officials who possessed intimate knowledge of regional conditions. The garden paths wound through carefully tended beds where roses bloomed in summer and holly berries brightened winter months. The changing seasons marked time's passage, as Victoria and Albert discussed matters that would affect the empire for decades to come. They spoke of constitutional arrangements that might allow colonial populations more control over local affairs while maintaining ultimate British authority. Victoria's evening hours were increasingly devoted to correspondence with the wives and daughters of colonial officials, creating informal networks of communication that provided insights into social conditions throughout the empire. These letters revealed how British families were adapting to life in tropical climates and frontier settlements, while also describing how their presence was affecting local communities. The women wrote about practical matters, how to keep food from spoiling in heat, how to treat unfamiliar illnesses, how to manage households with servants who spoke different languages. They also wrote about deeper concerns, loneliness and homesickness, the challenge of raising children far from grandparents and familiar customs, the difficulty of maintaining British identity while living among different cultures. The Queen learned about everything from medical challenges in equatorial territories to educational innovations in temperate colonies where British and indigenous children were learning to read from the same textbooks. She discovered that colonial life was transforming British families as much as British families were transforming colonial societies, creating hybrid cultures that were neither purely British nor purely indigenous. Her daily routine included regular consultations with military engineers who were planning infrastructure projects that would bind distant territories together through networks of roads, railways, and telegraph lines. Victoria studied detailed proposals for railway construction across the Indian subcontinent, understanding how these transportation arteries would enable rapid deployment of troops during emergencies, while also facilitating commercial development that would benefit both British investors and local populations. The engineers spread their plans across tables in the palace, explaining grades and curves, bridges and tunnels, stations and sidings. Victoria asked questions about costs and timelines, about where materials would come from and who would provide labor. She grasped that railways were as much political instruments as engineering projects, that where the rails went would determine which regions prospered and which remained isolated. She grasped the strategic importance of infrastructure investments that served multiple purposes simultaneously. A road built for military access also enabled farmers to bring crops to market. A telegraph line installed for government communication also allowed merchants to coordinate business. A harbor improved for naval vessels also accommodated commercial shipping. The Queen's breakfast conversations with returning colonial officials brought vivid descriptions of ceremonial events where traditional rulers formally accepted British protection while maintaining their authority over local affairs. She listened intently to accounts of elaborate ceremonies where ancient crowns were placed alongside British flags in rituals that acknowledged both imperial authority and indigenous sovereignty. These ceremonies were carefully choreographed to satisfy both British and local expectations. A traditional ruler might accept British protection using formulas that preserved his dignity and authority, while British officials gained the substance of control they sought. Both sides could claim victory. Both could feel that their essential interests had been protected. Victoria's correspondence with military commanders revealed her growing sophistication in understanding how limited British forces could maintain control over territories whose populations vastly outnumbered the available troops. Her letters emphasized the importance of recruiting local auxiliaries who could serve alongside British regulars, creating mixed units that combined European military discipline with indigenous knowledge of local terrain and tactics. These auxiliary forces became essential to imperial control. British troops provided the core of military power, but local soldiers who knew the language and country provided the numbers needed to actually maintain order across vast territories. The system worked because it offered opportunities for advancement to colonial subjects, while keeping ultimate control in British hands. She supported initiatives that would train colonial officers to command these integrated forces effectively. Military schools were established where promising young men from colonial populations could learn British military methods, gaining skills and status while also becoming invested in the imperial system's success. The royal nursery continued to serve as an unlikely center of imperial education, as Victoria's children absorbed geographical knowledge. Young Prince Albert Edward would build elaborate fortifications with wooden blocks while his mother reviewed reports from Gibraltar, unconsciously learning about strategic positioning through play. The prince would arrange his blocks to create walls and towers, gateways and battlements, all while listening to adult conversations about real fortifications protecting real harbors in real territories. Geography and strategy became as familiar as fairy tales, absorbed almost without effort through constant exposure. Princess Victoria would dress her dolls in costumes representing different colonial populations, inadvertently gaining appreciation for the cultural diversity that characterized the expanding empire. She had dolls in Indian saris and African wraps, in Chinese silks and Maori cloaks. Each doll had a name and a story, teaching the young princess that the empire encompassed real people with real lives. Prince Albert's systematic approach to intelligence gathering had created comprehensive understanding of how local conditions in different territories affected broader imperial interests. His morning routine included careful analysis of weather reports, crop yields, and population movements that could indicate emerging challenges or opportunities requiring royal attention. He tracked monsoon patterns and their impact on agriculture, drought conditions and their potential to cause famine, migration patterns and their implications for territorial control. This data-driven approach to governance enabled anticipation of problems before they became crises, allowing preventive action rather than merely reactive responses. The Prince Consort developed innovative analytical methods that enabled identification of patterns across multiple territories, providing early warning of potential problems that might otherwise escape notice until they became serious crises. He created charts and graphs that visualized trends, making it easier to spot anomalies and connections that might be invisible in raw data. Victoria's daily schedule reflected the accelerating pace of technological innovation that was transforming imperial communication and transportation. Steam-powered vessels could now carry messages between London and Bombay in just 6 weeks, while experimental telegraph lines were being constructed across vast distances to enable even faster coordination between colonial administrators and their superiors in the imperial capital. The Queen understood how these innovations would revolutionize governance by enabling more direct oversight of distant territories. Instructions could be sent and responses received with a speed that previous generations would have considered impossible. This compression of time and space fundamentally changed the nature of imperial administration. Her approach to territorial acquisition during this period emphasized careful evaluation of potential costs and benefits, rather than opportunistic expansion that might strain imperial resources. without providing substantial strategic advantages. Victoria insisted on detailed analysis of proposed acquisitions, considering not only immediate military and commercial benefits but also long-term implications for imperial stability and administrative efficiency. She would ask her ministers to prepare memoranda, analyzing any proposed territorial acquisition from multiple angles. What would it cost to acquire? What resources did it possess? What strategic value did it offer? How would other powers react? What were the risks and alternatives? Only after thorough analysis would she approve expansion. She supported expansion that would strengthen British security, while avoiding commitments that might prove impossible to maintain effectively. Victoria learned to distinguish between opportunities and traps, between territories that would enhance British power and those that would drain resources without providing commensurate benefits. The Queen's afternoon audiences with merchants and traders brought first-hand accounts of commercial opportunities in territories that remained largely unexplored by European entrepreneurs. She listened to descriptions of mineral deposits in African territories, agricultural potential in Australian regions, and trading possibilities with Pacific Island communities that had maintained their independence while developing commercial relationships with British merchants. The merchants spoke enthusiastically of riches waiting to be developed: gold and diamonds, copper and tin, ivory and rubber. They described fertile lands capable of growing valuable crops, forests filled with valuable timber, and populations eager to trade. Their accounts mixed genuine opportunity with exaggeration and wishful thinking, requiring careful evaluation. These conversations informed her understanding of how economic development could serve imperial expansion more effectively than military conquest. Territory acquired through military force required expensive occupation. Territory gained through commercial penetration often paid for itself through trade revenues, while requiring minimal administrative presence. Victoria's evening correspondence included detailed discussions with colonial governors about the challenges of implementing British legal systems in territories where traditional customs governed most aspects of daily life. Her letters revealed genuine concern for developing judicial procedures that would maintain essential British legal principles, while accommodating local practices that did not conflict with imperial authority. She understood that law was cultural as well as practical, that legal systems reflected deep assumptions about justice, authority, and social relationships. Imposing British law wholesale might create resistance and confusion. Better to adapt and accommodate where possible, maintaining core principles while allowing flexibility in implementation. She supported experimental approaches that would test different methods of legal integration before implementing them throughout entire regions. Some colonies might serve as laboratories where different approaches could be tried, evaluated, and refined before being adopted more widely. The royal couple's joint oversight of imperial finances had created unprecedented understanding of how colonial revenues could fund continued expansion, while also supporting development projects that would benefit local populations. Their breakfast discussions included detailed analysis of tax collection procedures, trade statistics, and infrastructure investments that would generate future income while demonstrating British commitment to improving living conditions throughout the empire. They reviewed budgets line by line, questioned expenditures, compared revenues across territories. Albert's systematic approach brought order to what had often been haphazard financial management. Victoria ensured that fiscal prudence did not prevent necessary investments in the empire's future. Victoria's daily routine included regular reviews of educational initiatives designed to create literate populations who could participate effectively in the expanding commercial and administrative networks that connected distant territories. She supported the establishment of schools where instruction was provided in both English and local languages, understanding that bilingual education would create colonial subjects who could serve as intermediaries between British authorities and indigenous populations while maintaining their cultural identities. Education was investment in the empire's future. Literate populations could read instructions, fill out forms, keep records, communicate across distances. They could participate in commerce and administration in ways that illiterate populations could not. But education also carried risks, as literate populations could organize resistance and articulate grievances more effectively than illiterate ones. The Queen's morning briefing increasingly included reports from territories where British influence was being established through diplomatic agreements rather than military occupation. She learned about negotiations with African kingdoms whose rulers accepted British protection in exchange for exclusive trading privileges, creating relationships that provided imperial advantages without requiring expensive military commitments. These protectorates offered an attractive model for expansion: British influence without British administration, British benefits without British costs. A local ruler continued governing his territory but accepted British guidance on foreign relations and commercial policy. British merchants gained privileged access while British taxpayers avoided the expense of direct rule. These diplomatic innovations offered models for expansion that could be replicated in other regions where direct conquest might prove too costly. Victoria encouraged governors to pursue such arrangements where possible, understanding that empire built on consent would prove more durable than empire built on conquest. Prince Albert's role as royal consort had evolved to include direct oversight of colonial intelligence operations that provided comprehensive information about conditions throughout the empire. His analytical capabilities enabled identification of connections between seemingly unrelated events in different territories, while his systematic approach to information processing ensured that important developments did not escape royal attention. The prince consort's summaries became essential reading for ministers responsible for imperial policy formulation and implementation. Cabinet members knew that if Albert had identified something as important, it deserved their attention. His judgment was trusted because it was consistently well-informed and carefully reasoned. Victoria's afternoon walks through the palace grounds provided opportunities for informal discussions with visiting colonial officials who could describe local conditions with greater candor than formal written reports typically allowed. Away from the formality of official audiences, in the relative privacy of garden paths, officials might speak more freely about challenges and failures as well as successes. These conversations revealed both successes and failures in imperial administration, helping the Queen understand which policies were achieving their intended objectives. Her ability to process critical feedback without defensiveness enabled continuous improvement in imperial governance. The Queen's evening hours were devoted to correspondence that maintained personal relationships with administrators throughout the empire, creating networks of loyalty that transcended formal governmental hierarchies. Her letters to colonial officials combined official guidance with personal interest in their families and circumstances, demonstrating royal concern that strengthened imperial bonds while providing additional channels for information about local conditions and challenges. She asked about health and happiness, about children's progress, and wives' welfare. She remembered birthdays and anniversaries. She congratulated promotions and consoled losses. These personal touches created bonds of affection and loyalty that purely formal relationships could never achieve. As 1846 approached, Victoria had established administrative systems that could accommodate continued territorial expansion while maintaining the quality of governance that preserved imperial unity across vast distances and diverse populations. Her daily routine of processing information from multiple continents, while managing complex family responsibilities, had created new models for royal authority that would influence monarchical traditions throughout the civilized world. The empire stood ready for another phase of unprecedented growth, with opportunities emerging that would test every aspect of the governmental innovations the royal couple had developed during their remarkable partnership in imperial leadership. Victoria's morning routine would soon encompass territories whose names remained unknown to European geographers as British influence continued spreading through networks of commerce, diplomacy, and carefully planned expansion. The dawnlight filtered through the tall windows of Windsor Castle as Victoria entered what historians would later recognize as the most decisive decade of imperial expansion in human history. The year 1847 brought with it a cascade of events that would transform scattered colonial possessions into the most powerful empire the world had ever witnessed. In her private apartments, the Queen would awaken each morning to find her writing desk laden with dispatches that chronicled the systematic extension of British authority into regions whose very existence had been mere speculation just a generation earlier. The dispatches arrived in leather pouches sealed with wax, carried by messengers who had traveled for weeks to deliver them. Victoria would break the seals and unfold the papers, her eyes scanning pages filled with news from territories so distant that their problems and opportunities seemed to belong to different worlds entirely. Her morning ritual had evolved into a complex choreography of imperial oversight, where she would nurse her latest child while simultaneously reviewing intelligence reports from territories spanning every climate zone on Earth. The soft cooing of Prince Arthur, born just months earlier, provided a gentle counterpoint to discussions of frontier warfare in Afghanistan and commercial negotiations in the treaty ports of China. The infant would nestle against her, seeking nourishment and comfort, while Victoria's mind worked through problems of governance and strategy affecting millions of people thousands of miles away. The contrast between the intimate and the imperial, the personal and the political, defined her daily experience. Victoria had learned to shift seamlessly between the intimate demands of motherhood and the vast responsibilities of governing populations that now numbered in the hundreds of millions. She could comfort a crying baby while dictating instructions for a colonial governor, could nurse an infant while reviewing troop deployments, could soothe a teething child while contemplating diplomatic initiatives. The Queen's breakfast conversations with Prince Albert had become the unofficial nerve center of imperial decision-making, where policies affecting entire continents were formulated between sips of Earl Grey tea and bites of buttered toast. Their dining room table served as an impromptu map room, where charts of unexplored African territories lay beside reports from Australian gold prospectors, whose discoveries were attracting thousands of fortune seekers from across the British Isles. The gold discoveries were transforming Australia from a penal colony into a land of opportunity, drawing free settlers who saw chances for wealth and advancement. Victoria read accounts of tent cities springing up overnight, of claims being staked and fortunes being made, of a frontier society developing its own rough-and-ready character far from British conventions. The couple had developed an almost telepathic understanding of each other's thoughts, enabling them to process enormous amounts of complex information with remarkable efficiency. Albert might begin a sentence and Victoria would finish it. She might raise a question and he would already be formulating the answer. Their minds worked in complementary ways, each strengthening the other. Victoria's mid-morning audiences now included a steady procession of adventurers and entrepreneurs, whose ambitions perfectly aligned with imperial objectives. She would receive these visitors in the crimson drawing room, where their weathered faces and exotic tales transported her imagination to landscapes she would never see but whose destinies she would ultimately control. Captain James Ross would describe the Antarctic territories he had claimed for the Crown, speaking of ice cliffs that rose hundreds of feet from dark waters, of seals and penguins in numbers beyond counting, of a frozen continent larger than Europe that might harbor untold resources beneath its ice. While merchants fresh from Singapore painted vivid pictures of trading opportunities that could generate revenues exceeding those of entire European nations. The royal correspondence during this period revealed Victoria's growing mastery of the subtle diplomacy required to maintain relationships with indigenous rulers whose cooperation was essential for peaceful expansion. Her letters to tribal chieftains and local potentates combined respectful acknowledgement of their traditional authority with firm assertions of British interests, creating frameworks for mutual benefit that avoided the enormous costs of military conquest. She learned to write in ways that allowed different readers to interpret her words differently, maintaining ambiguity that permitted both British and indigenous leaders to claim that their essential interests had been protected. This diplomatic flexibility enabled agreements that might have proven impossible if all terms had been stated explicitly. She had learned that a carefully worded message accompanied by appropriate gifts could achieve more lasting results than entire regiments of soldiers. A letter expressing royal regard, accompanied by a clock or telescope or other prestigious gift, could win a chieftain's cooperation more effectively than military threats. Prince Albert's systematic approach to colonial intelligence had created unprecedented awareness of how developments in one territory could affect stability throughout the empire. His morning routine included detailed analysis of meteorological reports that predicted monsoon patterns and demographic studies that revealed population movements requiring administrative attention. He created elaborate systems for organizing and cross-referencing information, enabling him to spot connections and patterns that less systematic minds would miss. A crop failure in one region might create opportunities for suppliers elsewhere. A gold rush in one colony might drain away labor from another. Everything connected, and Albert's methods made the connections visible. The prince consort had transformed scattered information into comprehensive understanding of imperial interconnections. What had been chaos became order. What had been confusion became clarity. His systematic approach enabled Victoria to govern more effectively because she understood more completely, and so the empire continued to grow and evolve, guided by a queen whose dedication matched her ability, supported by a consort whose intellect complemented her instincts. Together they were building something unprecedented in human history, a truly global empire held together not merely by military force but by networks of communication, administration, commerce, and shared interest. The hours of the night grow late, and the empire's story continues gently, as all good stories do, carrying us forward through time while allowing rest to come as it will. The rise continues, territory by territory, policy by policy, building toward heights that will astound the world and create legacies lasting long after Victoria herself has passed into history and memory. The morning of January 1st, 1848, arrived with unusual stillness across London, as if the city itself was holding its breath before plunging into a year that would reshape the political landscape of Europe and test every assumption about the stability of monarchical power. Victoria awoke to find frost patterns traced across her bedroom windows, delicate crystalline designs that dissolved under the warmth of her gaze. The palace was quiet in these early hours, with only the distant sounds of servants beginning their daily routines breaking the pre-dawn silence. Her first action was to move to the nursery, where her children slept in their small beds, their breathing soft and regular in the dim light. She would stand in the doorway for several minutes each morning, watching them sleep, reminding herself that the empire she was building would one day be theirs to manage and maintain. Princess Victoria lay curled beneath her coverlets, one small hand clutching her favorite doll. Prince Albert Edward sprawled across his bed in the careless abandon of childhood sleep, while baby Arthur slumbered in his cradle, occasionally making small sounds that tugged at his mother's heart. These quiet moments of maternal observation grounded Victoria in ways that no amount of prayer or meditation could achieve. Here were the reasons for everything she did, the living justification for the long hours spent reviewing reports, and the difficult decisions that kept her awake late into the night. The empire was not an abstraction but a legacy, something she was building not for herself but for these sleeping children. When she returned to her private chambers, her morning tea was waiting, steam rising from the delicate porcelain cup in soft wisps that caught the lamplight. The newspapers had already been delivered and laid out on her reading table, their pages filled with news from across Europe. Victoria unfolded the Times and began to read about growing unrest in France, where discontent with King Louis Philippe's government was reaching dangerous levels. The articles spoke of public meetings and demonstrations, of demands for reform and representation that were being met with increasing resistance from conservative forces. The Queen understood that what happened in France would inevitably affect Britain. The two nations were bound together by proximity and history, by commerce and competition, by the complex relationships that made them simultaneously rivals and partners in European affairs. If France fell into revolution, the tremors would be felt across the Channel, potentially inspiring similar movements among Britain's own working classes, who had their own grievances about representation. Prince Albert joined her before the household had fully awakened, bringing with him a portfolio of overnight dispatches from the Foreign Office. He settled into the chair across from her, his expression grave as he began to summarize the most important developments. The situation in Paris was deteriorating rapidly, he explained, with government forces increasingly unable to maintain order in the face of popular demonstrations. The French bourgeoisie, who had once supported Louis Philippe as a constitutional monarch, were now joining the calls for more radical reforms. Their conversation ranged across the implications for British interests, considering how revolution in France might affect the balance of power in Europe, and what position Britain should take regarding the unfolding crisis. Victoria's instinct was to support the principle of monarchy, but she also understood that blind opposition to reform could prove counterproductive. Perhaps there were lessons to be learned from French mistakes, ways that Britain could avoid similar upheaval by addressing legitimate grievances before they erupted into violence. The breakfast table that morning was quieter than usual, both Victoria and Albert absorbed in contemplation of the European situation. The children joined them as always, their cheerful chatter providing welcome distraction from heavier matters. Princess Victoria wanted to show her mother a drawing she had made, a picture of the palace gardens with flowers in improbable colors. Prince Albert Edward was full of questions about his upcoming birthday celebration. wondering whether there would be a pony as he had been promised. Victoria answered her children with patience and warmth, giving them the attention they deserved while a portion of her mind continued working through the implications of events across the Channel. This ability to maintain multiple simultaneous focuses had become second nature, allowing her to be fully present as a mother while never entirely setting aside her responsibilities as queen. It was a delicate balance, one that sometimes left her exhausted by day's end, but she had learned that both roles were essential to who she was and what she hoped to accomplish. By late February, revolution had indeed broken out in Paris. Louis-Philippe abdicated and fled to England, where he would live in exile, a fallen monarch whose failure served as a warning to other European rulers about the dangers of resisting necessary reforms. The French Second Republic was proclaimed, and across Europe, other movements began stirring. Inspired by the French example, revolution spread to Vienna and Berlin, to Milan and Prague, threatening to sweep away the old order entirely. Victoria watched these developments with careful attention, understanding that Britain's relative stability was not guaranteed but had to be actively maintained through wise governance and timely reforms. She held daily meetings with her ministers discussing what measures might be taken to address working-class grievances before they could fuel revolutionary sentiments. The Chartist movement, which had been demanding political reforms including universal male suffrage, was gaining renewed energy from European events, and the government needed to respond thoughtfully rather than simply with repression. The Queen's correspondence during this period revealed her sophisticated understanding of the relationship between domestic stability and imperial strength. Britain could not effectively govern a global empire if it was consumed by internal conflicts and social unrest. The working classes who labored in factories and mines were not enemies to be suppressed, but subjects whose welfare affected the entire nation's prosperity. Victoria supported measured reforms that would improve their conditions while preserving the essential structures of constitutional monarchy and parliamentary government. Her letters to colonial governors during these months emphasized the importance of maintaining stability in imperial territories while Europe was convulsed by revolution. The last thing Britain needed was colonial unrest compounding domestic challenges. Governors were instructed to be especially attentive to local grievances, to address legitimate concerns promptly, and to ensure that news from Europe did not inspire similar movements in territories that had their own reasons for dissatisfaction with British rule. Prince Albert's role during this crisis proved invaluable as he maintained regular contact with his relatives and connections across Europe, providing Victoria with insights into developments that official diplomatic channels might miss or delay. His morning analyses included detailed reports about revolutionary movements in German states, about the Habsburg Empire's struggles to maintain control over its diverse territory scene, and about the complex diplomatic maneuvering as various powers tried to turn the crisis to their advantage. The spring of 1848 brought massive Chartist demonstrations in London, with organisers claiming they would present a petition to Parliament with millions of signatures demanding political reforms. The government prepared for potential violence, bringing in additional troops and taking precautions to protect key buildings. Similarly, Victoria herself was advised to leave London temporarily, moving to the relative safety of Osborne House on the Isle of Wight with her young children. The Queen resisted this suggestion initially, feeling that abandoning the capital in a time of crisis would send the wrong message. But Albert convinced her that her first responsibility was to ensure the continuity of the monarchy, which meant protecting herself and the heirs to the throne. Reluctantly, she agreed to withdraw, though she insisted on receiving daily reports about the situation in London and maintained continuous correspondence with her ministers about the government's response. The Great Chartist demonstration of April 10th turned out to be far less threatening than many had feared. While thousands gathered on Kensington Common, the organisers ultimately decided against marching on Parliament. The Festa delivered peacefully, and the crowds dispersed without the violence that some had predicted. Britain had weathered the revolutionary storm that was consuming much of Europe. Victoria returned to London with renewed confidence in British institutions and the essential loyalty of her subjects. Unlike France or Austria, Britain had maintained stability through a combination of firm governance and genuine responsiveness to legitimate grievances. The lesson she drew from these events was that effective monarchy required balancing tradition with adaptation, maintaining authority while demonstrating concern for all subjects regardless of their social class. The remainder of 1848 saw Britain consolidating its position as the European upheavals gradually subsided. While continental monarchies struggled to restore order, Britain's commercial and imperial interests continued expanding. The gold discoveries in California and Australia were creating new opportunities for British merchants and migrants, while India remained the jewel in the imperial crown, providing enormous revenues through the East India Company's administration. Victoria's daily routine during this period included regular consultations with officials from the East India Company, who provided detailed reports about conditions across the subcontinent. She learned about the complex relationships between British administrators and Indian princes, about the gradual extension of British control through a combination of military force, diplomatic negotiation, and administrative efficiency. The company's private army was larger than most European nations' military forces, a fact that illustrated both the scale of British power in India and the challenges of maintaining that power across such vast and diverse territories. Her evening correspondence often included letters to British officials in India, offering guidance on matters ranging from taxation policies to religious sensitivities. Victoria was particularly concerned about the need to respect Indian customs and beliefs, understanding that heavy-handed interference in religious matters could provoke resistance that might prove impossible to contain. The lessons of history were clear enough. Empires that tried to completely suppress local cultures and religions inevitably faced rebellions that could destroy what had taken decades to build. Prince Albert's systematic approach to imperial administration proved especially valuable in managing Indian affairs, as he developed comprehensive understanding of the subcontinent's complex political geography. His morning routine included detailed study of maps showing the various princely states, British-controlled territories. He learned the names of dozens of Maharajas and Rajas, understanding which were reliable allies, which required careful watching, and which might prove dangerous if circumstances changed. The Queen's breakfast conversations with Albert increasingly focused on long-term strategies for Indian administration, considering how British authority could be made more efficient and sustainable. They discussed the possibility of eventually transferring control from the East India Company to the Crown directly, believing that royal governance might prove more stable and legitimate than corporate administration. Such a change would be complex and potentially controversial, but both recognized that it might eventually prove necessary. Victoria's afternoons during this period often included audiences with returning missionaries who brought accounts of their work in India and other imperial territories. She listened with genuine interest to their descriptions of schools and hospitals they had established, of conversions they had achieved, and of the challenges they faced in societies where other religions had ancient roots and sophisticated theological traditions. The Queen supported missionary work not only for religious reasons but because she believed that Christianity and British education could help create loyal subjects who would support rather than resist imperial authority. Her evening walks through the palace gardens provided opportunities for reflection on the remarkable expansion that had occurred during her decade on the throne. The empire now encompassed territories on every inhabited continent, governing populations that spoke hundreds of languages. The complexity of administering such diversity was staggering, requiring constant attention and adjustment to maintain the delicate balances that enabled relatively small numbers of British officials to control vast populations. The gardens themselves had been expanded and improved during these years, with new plantings that included specimens from across the empire. Roses from India bloomed alongside plants from Australia and South Africa, creating a living map of imperial reach. Victoria would sometimes pause beside these exotic flowers, touching their petals gently while contemplating the territories from which they had come. Each plant represented a connection, a link in the great chain that bound the empire together. As 1849 approached, Victoria's confidence in her role had grown substantially. The young queen, who had nervously accepted the crown 12 years earlier, had matured into a sovereign who understood the intricacies of both domestic politics and imperial administration. Her daily decisions were made with assurance born of experience, her judgments informed by years of careful study and practical application of governing principles. The Queen's morning routine now began earlier than ever, as the volume of imperial correspondence had grown to the point where it required several hours just to review the most important documents. Her private secretary would arrive with the overnight dispatches while Victoria was still at breakfast, and they would work through the materials together. identifying items requiring immediate attention, and those that could be delegated to ministers or dealt with later. The dispatches revealed an empire in constant motion, with challenges and opportunities emerging continuously across its vast extent. A report from the Governor-General of Canada described tensions between English and French-speaking populations that required careful diplomatic handling. Letters from Australia brought news of conflicts between settlers and Aboriginal populations, raising questions about land rights and the treatment of Indigenous peoples. Intelligence from India warned of growing discontent among certain sections of the native population who resented various British policies and practices. Victoria read each report carefully, asking questions when she needed clarification and making notes about matters she wanted to discuss with Albert. Her approach to these daily briefings had become more systematic over time, influenced by Albert's methodical habits. She maintained her own filing system for important correspondence, organized by territory and subject matter, enabling her to track ongoing situations and remember key details about complex problems that might take months or years to fully resolve. Her breakfast conversations with Albert had evolved into highly efficient working sessions where they could process enormous amounts of information in relatively short periods. They had developed a kind of shorthand communication, where a few words could convey complex ideas, because each understood the broader context. Albert might mention crop yields in Bengal, and Victoria would immediately grasp the implications for tax revenues and potential unrest. She might refer to gold production in Australia, and he would understand her concerns about inflation and economic disruption. The children were growing older and their education was becoming more formal and structured. Sincered's Métis Victoria was now learning languages and history, while Prince Albert Edward was beginning his introduction to the subjects that would prepare him eventually for kingship. The royal parents took active roles in overseeing their children's education, understanding that these young people would one day need to govern an empire that might be even larger and more complex than the one they currently administered. Victoria's mid-morning audiences during this period included regular meetings with educators and scholars who advised on both her children's education. She was particularly interested in how schools in colonial territories could best serve both British interests and local needs, creating populations that were literate and skilled while also loyal to the Crown and sympathetic to British values and methods. The conversations revealed the tensions inherent in colonial education. Schools that taught only British subjects and ignored local languages and traditions might create resentment and alienation. But schools that focused exclusively on traditional knowledge would fail to prepare students for participation in the modern commercial and administrative systems that Britain was establishing. The solution lay somewhere in between, creating curricula that honored local cultures while providing skills needed for success in the changing world. Her correspondence with colonial educators revealed Victoria's genuine concern for the welfare of children throughout the empire, regardless of their backgrounds or circumstances. She wanted to know whether schools had adequate buildings and supplies, whether teachers were properly trained and fairly compensated, whether children were actually learning and benefiting from instruction. The Queen understood that educational investments made today would determine the empire's character and stability in future decades. Prince Albert's afternoon schedule increasingly included consultations with engineers and scientists. The telegraph network was expanding rapidly, with lines being extended across continents and even beginning to span oceans through underwater cables. The technical challenges of laying cables across vast distances were enormous, but the potential benefits justified the enormous expenses. Once completed, these communication networks would enable coordination across the empire that previous generations would have considered miraculous. Victoria took particular interest in the telegraph projects, understanding how they would revolutionize her ability to govern distant territories. Messages that currently took months to send and receive could eventually be transmitted in hours or even minutes. This compression of time would fundamentally change the nature of imperial administration, enabling the kind of centralized control that had previously been impossible across such vast distances. Her evening hours were devoted to correspondence that maintained the personal relationships that supplemented official governmental channels throughout the empire. Victoria wrote regularly to dozens of officials and their families, creating networks of loyalty and communication. These personal letters discussed everything from children's health to local weather conditions, from social events to political developments, creating a rich texture of information that official reports could never capture. The Queen's letter writing had become more efficient over the years as she developed standard formulations for common situations, while maintaining the personal touches that made each recipient feel individually valued. She had learned to write quickly without sacrificing thoughtfulness, covering several topics in a single page while maintaining a warm and engaged tone throughout. As 1849 drew to a close, Victoria could look back on a decade of remarkable achievement. The empire had more than doubled in extent and population since her accession. British commerce dominated global trade networks, and technological innovations were binding distant territories together with unprecedented efficiency. The revolutionary upheavals that had consumed Europe had left Britain largely untouched, demonstrating the essential stability of its constitutional arrangements, properly reformed and administered. Yet Victoria understood that past success was no guarantee of future prosperity. The empire faced constant challenges that required vigilant attention and wise management. Military threats from rival powers, economic disruptions from changing trade patterns, social unrest from populations adapting to rapid change, and the endless complexity of governing diverse peoples across vast distances, all demanded continuous effort. The Queen's approach to these challenges had matured considerably over her years on the throne. She no longer expected simple solutions to complex problems or imagined that good intentions alone would produce good outcomes. Experience had taught her that governance required patience and persistence, that setbacks were inevitable, and that success often came incrementally through sustained effort, rather than dramatic breakthroughs. Her daily routine reflected this mature understanding of imperial administration. Victoria no longer tried to personally control every detail, but had learned to delegate effectively while maintaining oversight of essential matters. She trusted her ministers and governors to handle most routine decisions while reserving her own attention for situations that required royal judgment or where conflicting considerations needed to be balanced. Prince Albert's role had evolved similarly, from attempting to master every aspect of imperial administration to focusing on the systematic analysis and long-term planning that enabled more effective governance across the board. His mornings were spent identifying patterns and trends that might escape notice in the daily press of events, while his afternoons focused on developing comprehensive strategies that could guide policy over years or decades, rather than months or weeks. The royal couple's evening discussions had become the most productive part of their daily routine, as they could reflect on the day's developments with perspective that was impossible during the rush of morning briefings and afternoon audiences. These quiet conversations, conducted in their private study, while the palace settled into nighttime routines, allowed them to think strategically about the empire's future direction and to consider problems from multiple angles before committing to particular courses of action. Victoria would often sit in her favorite chair beside the fire, her knitting in her lap, providing something for her hands to do while her mind worked through complex problems. Albert would pace the room, his movements helping him think as he articulated ideas and tested arguments. They had learned over the years to challenge each other's thinking without giving offense, to play devil's advocate while remaining supportive, and to admit uncertainty or error without embarrassment. These conversations ranged across every aspect of imperial governance, from the philosophical principles that should guide British rule to the practical details of implementing policies in specific territories. They discussed what Britain owed to its colonial subjects, how to balance extraction of resources with investment in local development, whether assimilation or pluralism should be the long-term goal for imperial administration, and how to maintain British power while accommodating legitimate aspirations for self-governance among colonial populations. The sincerest, evident questions were profound and the answers uncertain, but Victoria and Albert understood that wrestling with these issues thoughtfully was essential to responsible imperial governance. They could not simply act from instinct or tradition, but needed to constantly examine their assumptions and consider whether current policies remained appropriate for changing circumstances. As the new year of 1850 dawned, Victoria was pregnant once again, expecting her 7th child. The pregnancy progressed smoothly despite her demanding schedule, as she had learned over the years how to maintain her duties while accommodating the physical demands of carrying a child. Her morning sickness was mild and passed quickly, and she remained active and engaged with imperial affairs throughout the pregnancy. The birth of Prince Arthur on May 1st brought joy to the royal household. The infant was healthy and vigorous, his strong cries filling the palace rooms and announcing his arrival with appropriate drama. Victoria recovered quickly from the delivery and was soon back to her regular routine, nursing the baby while simultaneously reviewing dispatches and conducting business from her private chambers. The Queen's ability to balance motherhood with sovereignty had become one of her defining characteristics, demonstrating that these roles were not contradictory. Being a mother made her more understanding of the human dimensions of governance, more aware of how policies affected families and children, more committed to building an empire that would provide security and opportunity for future generations. And being a queen gave her mothering a larger purpose, as she raised children who would one day help govern vast territories and populations. Victoria's correspondence during this period revealed her growing interest in the conditions of working-class families throughout the empire. She read reports about living conditions in industrial cities, about child labor in factories and mines, about the struggles of families trying to survive on inadequate wages. These accounts troubled her, not just for humanitarian reasons but because she understood that widespread poverty and hardship threatened social stability and undermined the legitimacy of existing institutions. She began supporting reform initiatives more actively, using her influence to encourage Parliament to pass legislation, improving working conditions and expanding educational opportunities for working-class children. The Queen understood that such reforms were not merely charitable gestures but essential investments in Britain's future strength and stability. A healthy, educated population would be more productive economically and more loyal politically than one that was impoverished and ignorant. Prince Albert's involvement in the planning for the Great Exhibition of 1851 consumed much of his attention during this period. The exhibition was intended to showcase British industrial and technological achievements while also demonstrating the nation's global reach through displays of products from across the empire. Albert threw himself into the project with characteristic thoroughness, overseeing everything from the design of the Crystal Palace that would house the exhibition to the selection of items to be displayed. Victoria supported the project enthusiastically, understanding that it would serve multiple purposes simultaneously. Would demonstrate British technological superiority to potential rivals, strengthen popular pride in national achievements, provide educational opportunities for working-class visitors, and celebrate the empire's diversity and extent. The exhibition would also generate tourism and commercial activity that would benefit London's economy. The Queen's daily routine during the exhibition planning included regular consultations with Albert about various aspects of the project. They discussed the design of the building, the organization of displays, the arrangements for visitors, and the diplomatic implications of inviting participation from other nations. Every detail required attention, from the color of the paint, to the placement of fountains, to the schedule of opening ceremonies. Her evening walks through the palace gardens often took her past the construction site where the Crystal Palace was rising in Hyde Park. Victoria would watch the workers assembling the revolutionary building, its iron framework and glass panels creating a structure unlike anything London had seen before. The palace gleamed in the evening light, reflecting the setting sun in thousands of glass panes, a monument to British engineering skill and industrial capability. As autumn approached, the Crystal Palace neared completion and preparations for the exhibition's opening intensified. Victoria reviewed the invitation lists for opening ceremonies, approved the schedule of royal visits during the exhibition's run, and practiced the speech she would deliver at the inauguration. She understood that this event would be closely watched throughout Europe and beyond, and that the exhibition's success or failure would reflect on Britain's prestige and influence. The Queen's correspondence during these months included letters to foreign royalty and dignitaries, encouraging them to attend the exhibition's opening or to send representatives if they could not come personally. She emphasized how the exhibition would benefit all nations by promoting technological exchange and commercial relationships, carefully framing British achievement as contributing to universal human progress rather than merely advancing narrow national interests. Prince Albert's evening discussions with Victoria during this period often focused on the larger meanings and implications of the exhibition. He saw it not just as a display of products but as a demonstration of certain principles about progress, peace, and international cooperation. The exhibition would show that nations could compete peacefully through commerce and innovation rather than through warfare and conquest. It would celebrate human creativity and industry, while promoting understanding between different peoples and cultures. Victoria appreciated Albert's idealism while maintaining a more pragmatic understanding of the exhibition's purposes. She saw it primarily as an assertion of British power and prestige, a demonstration that Britain led the world in industrial development and imperial administration. But she also recognized that framing the exhibition in terms of universal progress and international cooperation would make it more appealing to foreign participants and visitors while potentially blunting criticisms from those who might otherwise see it as simple triumphalism. The months leading up to the exhibition's opening in May 1851 were filled with intense preparation and growing excitement throughout Britain. Victoria felt the anticipation building, sensing that this event would be remembered as a defining moment of her reign. The exhibition would showcase what had been accomplished during her years on the throne, demonstrating the remarkable transformation that had occurred in British society and in the empire's extent and influence. Her daily routine during these final weeks of preparation was exhausting, as she tried to maintain her regular responsibilities while also fulfilling all the additional demands associated with the exhibition. She reviewed designs for the opening ceremony, approved guest lists for official receptions, examined catalogues of exhibition displays, and rehearsed her opening speech until she could deliver it with perfect confidence and appropriate dignity. The nights were short during this period, as Victoria often worked late reviewing documents and correspondence before finally allowing herself to rest. She would lie in bed thinking about all the details that still needed attention, mentally reviewing lists and schedules, occasionally rising to make notes about matters she needed to address the following day. Albert would sometimes wake to find her at her writing desk in the pre-dawn darkness, working by candlelight while the household still slept. Yet despite the exhaustion and stress, Victoria felt energized by the sense of approaching culmination. The Great Exhibition would mark a milestone in her reign, a moment when the achievements of the past 14 years would be displayed for the world to see and appreciate. It would demonstrate that Britain under her rule had prospered and progressed, that the empire had expanded responsibly, and that technological innovation had improved the lives of her subjects while strengthening the nation's power and influence. The Queen understood that the exhibition was in some sense about her own legacy, about establishing her place in history as a monarch who had presided over remarkable achievements. She wanted to be remembered not just as a queen who had worn the crown, but as one who had actively governed, making decisions that shaped her nation and empire for the better. The exhibition would help secure that legacy, creating a public memory of Victorian achievement that would endure long after the temporary Crystal Palace had been dismantled. As April drew to a close, final preparations reached fever pitch. The exhibition spaces were being arranged and perfected, displays were being installed and adjusted, and the Crystal Palace itself received its finishing touches. Victoria made several private visits to inspect the progress, walking through the great building and marveling at what had been created. The structure was enormous, covering acres of Hyde Park, yet it felt light and airy thanks to the glass walls and high ceilings that allowed natural light to flood every corner. He paused beside displays from various parts of the empire, examining products from India and Australia, Canada and South Africa, the West Indies and various Pacific territories. Each display represented a story of British expansion and administration, of resources being developed and populations being governed. The diversity was remarkable, showcasing everything from raw materials to finished manufactures, from traditional crafts to modern industrial products. The Queen's evening discussions with Albert during these final days focused on the opening ceremony itself, reviewing every detail to ensure nothing would go wrong on that crucial day. They practiced the procession route, timed the various speeches and presentations, and planned for contingencies in case of bad weather or other unexpected problems. Everything possible was being done to ensure success, and both Victoria and Albert felt confident that the exhibition would meet or exceed expectations. The night before the opening, Victoria could barely sleep despite her exhaustion. She lay awake thinking about the ceremony, mentally rehearsing her speech and visualizing how everything would unfold. When she finally drifted off, her dreams were filled with images of the Crystal Palace and crowds of visitors, of dignitaries from around the world, and displays showcasing British achievements. She awoke before dawn on opening day, May 1st, 1851, feeling a mixture of excitement and nervousness that reminded her of her coronation day 13 years earlier. Today would be another defining moment, another ceremony that would mark a milestone in her reign and in British history. As she prepared for the day ahead, Victoria said a quiet prayer asking for strength and wisdom, for success in the immediate ceremony, and for blessings on the longer project of building an empire that would bring prosperity and progress to millions of subjects across the globe. The morning light was soft and golden as it filtered through the palace windows, casting warm glows across the rooms where Victoria completed her preparations. Her ladies-in-waiting helped her dress in an elaborate gown chosen specifically for the occasion, its fabric shimmering in the light, its cut designed to project both majesty and femininity. She wore diamonds at her throat and in her hair, symbols of wealth and power that would catch the light as she moved through the Crystal Palace. Prince Albert dressed with equal care in formal attire that emphasized his role as the exhibition's primary sponsor and organizer. Together they made final adjustments, checking their appearances in mirrors and rehearsing once more the sequence of events that would unfold over the coming hours. The children were being prepared as well, dressed in miniature versions of formal court attire, excited about the spectacle they would witness. As the royal carriages rolled toward Hyde Park through streets lined with cheering crowds, Victoria felt her nervousness giving way to confidence and satisfaction. The people were celebrating, London was at its finest, and the exhibition stood ready to demonstrate British achievement to the world. Whatever challenges lay ahead for the empire, today would be a moment of pure triumph. A celebration of how far Britain had come and a promise of even greater accomplishments yet to be achieved. The Crystal Palace rose before them as they approached, its glass walls gleaming in the morning sun like a giant jewel set in the green expanse of the park. Victoria gazed at it with wonder and pride, understanding that this remarkable building represented something larger than itself. It symbolized human ingenuity and aspiration, the capacity to create beauty and order, to harness nature and technology in service of progress and civilization. As the carriages came to a halt and Victoria prepared to step down and enter the exhibition hall for the opening ceremony, she took a deep breath and composed herself for the moment ahead. This was her empire on display, her reign being celebrated, her legacy being established. The Crystal Palace awaited, filled with wonders from across the globe, ready to receive its queen and to begin its brief but glorious existence as a monument to Victorian achievement and British imperial power. And so we drift forward through time, through months and years of Victoria's long reign, through the rise and expansion of the empire that bore her name, through achievements and challenges, triumphs and setbacks, all flowing together like a great river moving toward the sea.